Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be truly alone in a place designed for thousands, now silent and decaying? We're diving deep into the most terrifying abandoned locations, where every shadow holds a story and every sound could be an apparition. Prepare yourself for encounters that will make your blood run cold. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door of Jackson's apartment, like a serpent finding its way through the smallest crack. No postmark, no return address, just thick, cream-colored paper that felt wrong between his fingers, too cold, too smooth, as if it had been pressed from something that was never meant to be touched by human hands. The Bellwood Psychiatric Hospital awaits your exploration. The letter read in elegant script. 7 rooms, 7 stories, 7 souls seeking resolution. Jackson Hartwell, a British urban explorer whose YouTube channel had gained modest fame documenting abandoned places across the American South, stared at the coordinates printed below. Red River Parish, Louisiana, a place he'd never heard of, yet somehow felt he'd been waiting his entire life to find. The letter continued. Others have been chosen. Others have accepted. The asylum remembers every footstep, every breath, every scream that never came. 3 days later, Jackson found himself driving down a narrow gravel road that seemed to swallow his headlights whole. The GPS had stopped working 20 miles back, but somehow he knew exactly where to turn, where to slow down, where to stop. It was as if the road itself was guiding him, pulling him forward with invisible threads wrapped around his chest. The Bellwood Psychiatric Hospital emerged from the Louisiana darkness like a fever dream made of brick and iron. Built in 1847, it had housed the mentally ill, the criminally insane, and those whose only crime was being different in a world that demanded conformity. Closed in 1978 after a series of unexplained deaths, it had stood empty for 45 years, waiting. Jackson parked beside 3 other vehicles, a rented SUV with Canadian plates, a weathered pickup truck bearing Australian registration, and a sleek sedan with German diplomatic tags. His hands trembled as he gathered his equipment: night vision cameras, audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, tools of his trade, suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever waited beyond those towering walls. The front entrance stood open, its heavy wooden doors hanging on rusted hinges like the mouth of a corpse. Jackson stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature drop 15 degrees. His breath formed small clouds in the beam of his flashlight as footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Is anyone there?" A woman emerged from the shadows, tall, blonde, with the confident stride of someone accustomed to dangerous places. "Victoria Campbell," she said, extending a hand. "Melbourne Urban Exploration Society. Got your invitation too, I'm guessing." Before Jackson could respond, 2 more figures appeared from different corridors. "Heinrich Müller," announced a man in his 30s, German accent thick with nervousness. "Paranormal investigative journalist from Berlin." Behind him, a younger woman with distinctive Canadian accent introduced herself as Brooke Morrison, documentary filmmaker from Toronto. The 4 strangers stood in the asylum's main hall, each clutching their own mysterious invitation, each drawn by forces they couldn't understand. The building seemed to pulse around them, as if it had been holding its breath for decades and could finally exhale now that its guests had arrived. "Did any of you research this place before coming?" Heinrich asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously. Victoria shook her head. "Couldn't find anything online. No historical records, no urban exploration forums mentioning it. It's like the place doesn't exist until you're standing inside it." Jackson examined the walls more closely with his flashlight. The paint was peeling in strange patterns, not random decay, but deliberate designs that hurt to look at directly. "These symbols," he murmured. "They're carved into the plaster underneath the paint. How old are they?" A child's laughter echoed from the upper floors, clear and bright and absolutely impossible. The 4 explorers froze, looking at each other with widening eyes. "Motion detectors," Brooke whispered, pulling out her equipment. "I'm reading movement on the 2nd floor, northeast corner." Heinrich's EMF detector began clicking rapidly. Massive electromagnetic disturbance. The readings are off every scale I've ever seen. They climbed the main staircase together, their footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to match a heartbeat thundering through the walls. The second floor stretched before them like a maze of identical doorways, each leading to patient rooms that held 45 years of accumulated darkness. Victoria pushed open the first door. Room 237. Inside, a single hospital bed sat perfectly made with crisp white sheets that looked as if they'd been changed that morning. On the nightstand, a glass of water sat half empty, condensation still beating on its surface. "This is impossible," she breathed. "No one's been in this building for decades." Jackson moved to the window and wiped away decades of grime. Outside, the view showed not the Louisiana countryside they'd driven through, but a bustling city street filled with horse-drawn carriages and women in Victorian dress. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestone roads, while men in top hats hurried past. "We're not just in an abandoned building," he realized with growing horror. "We're in its memory. We're seeing what it remembers from when it was alive." The temperature plummeted another 20 degrees. Their breath now came in thick white clouds as frost began forming on the windows. Heinrich's equipment went haywire, clicking and beeping in frantic patterns. "Something's coming," Brooke whispered, her camera capturing shapes moving in the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. Multiple somethings. There in the walls, in the ceiling, everywhere. From room 238 came the sound of someone crying, deep, adult sobs filled with a grief so profound it seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. Victoria approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Inside, a man in a straitjacket sat rocking in the corner. His hair was white as snow, his eyes clouded with cataracts, but when he looked up at Victoria, she saw something that made her stumble backward in terror. The man had no face beneath his eyes, just smooth skin where his nose and mouth should have been. "The treatment worked," came a voice from everywhere and nowhere. No more screaming, no more protests, no more human noise. The fourth floor access seemed to call to them, though none of them remembered deciding to climb higher. They found themselves ascending stairs that creaked with footsteps that weren't their own, following sounds that seemed to come from inside their own heads. Jackson's radio crackled to life. "Jackson, Jackson, can you hear me?" It was his own voice, but older, more desperate. "Don't go to the fourth floor. Please. We're still here. We never left. We never left." "Who is this?" Jackson demanded, but the radio fell silent except for static that sounded almost like whispering. The fourth floor was different, cleaner, as if time moved differently here, or perhaps had stopped moving altogether. The door stood open, revealing rooms that defied physics, spaces that seemed larger inside than the building could possibly contain, corridors that stretched beyond what the eye could follow. In room 407, they found the first recording equipment. Modern digital cameras and audio devices scattered across the floor as if dropped in sudden flight. Heinrich picked up a camera and checked its memory card. "Footage from 3 months ago," he reported. "British accents. They're exploring this same floor. But look at this." The playback showed 4 people in the exact same positions where Jackson, Victoria, Heinrich, and Brooke now stood. Same clothes, same equipment, same terrified expressions. "That's impossible," Victoria breathed. Unless we've been here before," Jackson finished. "Unless we've done this before. Unless we're the ones who disappeared." The recordings continued to play, showing their doppelgangers discovering the same evidence, making the same realizations, climbing toward the same inevitable conclusion. In the final moments of the video, the camera turned upward to reveal a ceiling that pulsed like living flesh, covered in eyes that blinked in unison. "The asylum feeds on repetition," whispered a voice that came from their own throats. The same story, told over and over. The same fear, experienced fresh each time. The same ending, always arriving right on schedule. Brooke's documentary camera captured their reflections in a broken mirror mounted on the wall. But their reflections were different, older, more hollow-eyed, wearing hospital gowns instead of their exploration gear. In the reflection, they had been patients here all along. "We need to leave," Heinrich said, backing toward the stairs. "Now, before whatever happened to the others happens to us." But the stairs were gone. Where the stairwell had been, now only a solid wall remained, painted with the same impossible symbols they'd seen throughout the building. The elevator at the end of the hall stood open, its brass gates gleaming despite decades of supposed abandonment. "Going down?" asked a cheerful voice from inside the elevator. A woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1920s smiled at them with too many teeth. "Basement level. Hydrotherapy. Electroshock. Lobotomies. All the modern treatments for what ails the mind." They had no choice but to enter. The elevator descended far longer than should have been possible, passing floors that couldn't exist in the building they'd explored. Sublevel 3. Sublevel 7. Sublevel 12. Each floor they passed showed glimpses of horrors beyond imagination. Operating rooms where procedures continued on patients who had died decades ago. Cells where inmates sat staring at walls covered in their own blood. Common areas where group therapy sessions were conducted by doctors whose faces had rotted away years ago. The basement opened into a vast space that stretched beyond their flashlight beams. Ancient medical equipment filled the darkness, machines designed to cure madness through pain, devices that measured sanity through suffering. And everywhere, the sound of dripping water that might have been something else entirely. The treatment records, Victoria discovered, finding filing cabinets that stretched into the darkness like metallic trees. She opened one drawer and found thousands of patient files, all bearing today's date, all bearing their names. Jackson opened his file. Patient exhibits obsessive need to explore abandoned locations. Recommend immediate isolation and corrective therapy. Subject believes he is documenting empty buildings, but is actually participating in therapeutic reenactment of traumatic memories. Heinrich's file was similar. Patient suffers from paranoid delusions about supernatural entities. Has convinced himself he is investigating paranormal activity rather than receiving treatment for severe psychological break from reality. The files revealed the truth in clinical, sterile language. They weren't urban explorers drawn by mysterious invitations. They were patients at Bellwood Psychiatric Hospital, participating in an experimental therapy program designed to help them process trauma through controlled reenactment of their fears. But if that were true, then why could they remember their lives before this place? Why did they have equipment, vehicles, identities from the outside world? "Because," said Dr. Adelaide Thornton, stepping from the shadows in a white coat stained with substances that had dried decades ago. "The mind creates whatever reality it needs to survive. You've been here for 45 years. You've lived the same day over and over, each time convinced it's your first visit, each time discovering the same terrible truth." Jackson looked at his hands. In the basement's strange light, he could see through them. They were translucent, fading, like old photographs left too long in the sun. "The real urban explorers came through here 3 months ago," Dr. Thornton continued. "For young people with cameras and curiosity. They found your bodies in the basement, patients who died during the hospital's final experimental treatments in 1978. But death doesn't end suffering here. Death just changes its shape." Victoria's equipment began recording on its own, capturing footage of their slow realization that they were already dead, already trapped, already doomed to repeat this discovery forever. Her camera showed the basement as it truly was, filled not with medical equipment, but with 4 hospital beds, each containing a desiccated corpse clutching modern exploration gear that had been placed in their hands by visitors who thought they were just documenting an abandoned building. "Every few months, someone new finds this place," Heinrich read from a journal left by previous visitors. "They always bring cameras. They always document everything. And they always leave the evidence behind for us to find, so we can remember what we really are." The hydrotherapy room called to them from the deepest part of the basement. Ancient tubs filled with water that had been standing stagnant since 1978, yet somehow remained crystal clear. Brooke approached the nearest tub and saw her reflection, not as she appeared to herself, but as she truly was. A young woman who had drowned during treatment, held underwater until her struggles stopped, until her mind finally found peace in madness. "The water remembers," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water in her veins. "It remembers every patient who went under and never came back up." Jackson found his own tub. The water showed him strapped to an electroshock table, voltage coursing through his brain until something essential burned away forever. The treatment had worked. He no longer experienced the compulsions that had brought him to the hospital. He no longer experienced anything at all. Victoria's reflection showed her in a surgical chair, a hole drilled in her skull, portions of her brain removed with the casual precision of a carpenter planing wood. The procedure had been declared a success. Her aggressive tendencies were completely eliminated, along with her capacity for independent thought. Heinrich's water revealed the truth he'd spent decades trying to document, that he'd been a patient here, not an investigator. His paranoid delusions about supernatural entities had been treated through a combination of isolation, medication, and procedures that had left his mind shattered into fragments that could never reassemble. The realization hit them simultaneously. They weren't just trapped in the asylum's memory. They were the asylum's memory. Every patient who had died here, every treatment that had gone too far, every scream that had been silenced forever. They were the hospital's way of remembering its own crimes, doomed to relive their deaths through the eyes of visitors who thought they were just exploring an abandoned building. But the explorers who came 3 months ago, Brooke said desperately, they escaped. They left this equipment behind and got out. Dr. Thornton's laughter echoed through the basement like breaking glass. Did they? Or are they upstairs right now, finding mysterious invitations slipped under doors, driving down dark roads toward a building that calls to them with invisible threads wrapped around their chests? Jackson looked at his camera's memory card. It showed footage of the same exploration they'd just completed, but the timestamp was from 3 months ago. And before that, 6 months ago. And before that, a year ago. The same 4 people, making the same discoveries, learning the same truth, over and over in an endless cycle. "The asylum needs witnesses," Dr. Thornton explained, her form flickering between the young doctor she'd been and the ancient corpse she'd become. "It needs people to see what happened here, to understand what was done in the name of treatment and healing. But witnesses can't leave. Witnesses become part of the story they came to document." The temperature rose suddenly, as if the building was taking a deep breath. Their equipment began shutting down one by one, cameras stopping recording, flashlights dimming, EMF detectors falling silent. The basement was preparing to sleep again, to wait for the next group of explorers who would receive mysterious invitations and feel compelled to investigate an asylum that existed in the space between memory and nightmare. "We have to warn them," Victoria said desperately. "The next ones who come. We have to find a way to break the cycle." But even as she spoke, she could feel herself fading, becoming translucent, returning to whatever state of existence she occupied between visitations. Her memories of the outside world were already growing dim. Had she really been an urban explorer from Australia? Or was that just another story the asylum had told her to make her death more palatable? Jackson tried to speak, to call out warnings to future explorers, but his voice was already becoming the whisper in the walls that would draw the next group deeper into the building. Heinrich's desperate attempts to document their discovery turned into the electromagnetic disturbances that would register on future investigators' equipment. Brooke's camera became one more piece of abandoned gear for the next visitors to find and puzzle over. The last thing they saw before consciousness faded was the elevator ascending without them, carrying empty air toward the surface, where 4 new invitations were already forming, written in elegant script on cream-colored paper that felt wrong between human fingers. Outside, somewhere in the Louisiana darkness, 4 new vehicles were already turning down the gravel road. A rental car with Irish plates, a motorcycle with New Zealand registration, a van bearing Swedish diplomatic tags, and a pickup truck from Manitoba. Their drivers had all received the same invitation, felt the same inexplicable compulsion, made the same decision to investigate an asylum that didn't appear on any maps, but somehow felt like home. The Bellwood Psychiatric Hospital settled back into patient waiting, its windows dark, its doors hanging open like the mouth of a corpse. In a few hours, new voices would echo through its halls, new equipment would capture the same impossible evidence, new discoveries would lead to the same inevitable conclusion. Because the asylum remembered everything, every patient, every treatment, every death that had occurred within its walls. And it would continue remembering, through the eyes of explorers who thought they were documenting the past, but were actually becoming part of it, until every injustice had been witnessed, every scream had been heard, every soul had been given the opportunity to tell their story one more time. The Red River flowed on in the darkness, carrying whispers toward the Gulf of Mexico, while deep in the asylum's basement, for new patient files began forming in filing cabinets that existed in the space between memory and nightmare, waiting to be discovered by visitors who would never realize they were already dead until it was far too late to matter. And in the morning, the invitations would arrive again, slip beneath doors like serpents finding their way through the smallest cracks, written on paper that felt too cold, too smooth, as if it had been pressed from something that was never meant to be touched by human hands. The copper taste of fear clung to Oliver's tongue as he stared at the comment that appeared on his live stream at exactly 3:33 a.m. "Turn around, Oliver. We've been waiting." But he was alone in his apartment in Vancouver. The live stream had ended hours ago. His laptop was closed. Yet somehow, impossibly, comment was there, glowing on his phone screen with a timestamp that matched the exact moment he'd read it. Oliver Chun had built his YouTube channel, Urban Decay Explorations, on one simple principle: find the places that civilized society had forgotten, and make them remember. Abandoned hospitals, derelict schools, ghost towns swallowed by wilderness. His 847,000 subscribers craved the authentic terror that commercial horror films couldn't deliver. But Raven's Hollow Mine in British Columbia was different. The research had taken him 3 weeks. Archive footage from the 1987 collapse. Newspaper clippings that spoke of 17 miners trapped 200 feet below ground. Rescue attempts that lasted 6 days before the unstable Earth claimed the tunnels forever. The official report called it a geological impossibility. The mountain had somehow shifted, sealing the mine's entrance as if the Earth itself had swallowed it whole. What the reports didn't mention were the sounds. Every October, on the anniversary of the collapse, hikers reported hearing something from beneath the old mining site. Not quite human voices, not quite screams. Something that lived in the space between the two, clawing its way through solid rock with fingernails worn to bone. The town of Ravens Hollow had been evacuated in 1991. Too many disappearances. Too many people who ventured too close to where the mine used to be and simply never came back. The government called it a geological hazard zone and erected warning signs that nobody ever bothered to maintain. Oliver had found it anyway. The drive from Vancouver took 8 hours through increasingly desolate mountain roads until civilization became nothing more than a memory in his rearview mirror. Trees pressed against the narrow path like arthritic fingers, their branches scraping against his car with sounds that reminded him uncomfortably of fingernails on metal. Ravens Hollow appeared suddenly, as if the forest had been hiding it. A collection of rotting wooden buildings clustered around what had once been a main street. Empty windows stared down at him like hollow eye sockets. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even his car engine seemed muffled, as if the very air was thick with something unseen. He'd set up his equipment in the old company store, its shelves still lined with mining supplies from 3 decades ago. Hard hats covered in dust, pickaxes that would never again bite into stone, photographs of men who would never come home. "What's up, decay hunters?" he'd said to his camera as the sun began to set. "Oliver here, and tonight we're exploring one of Canada's most haunted locations, Ravens Hollow Mine, where 17 miners were trapped alive in 1987, and where locals claim their voices can still be heard every October." The live stream had gone perfectly for the first 2 hours. He'd explored the abandoned buildings, shared the history, built the atmosphere that his viewers craved. The chat had been active, engaged, excited. Then the temperature had dropped. Not gradually, all at once, as if someone had opened a massive freezer door. His breath began to fog. The camera lens started to frost over. And from somewhere beneath the town, something had begun to scratch. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Rhythmic, patient, getting closer. "You guys hearing this?" He'd whispered to his camera, but the chat had gone silent. 8,000 viewers watching, and not a single comment. Just empty, scrolling darkness where their words should have been. That's when he'd seen the glow. Deep beneath the abandoned town, where the mine entrance should have been permanently sealed, a faint amber light had begun to pulse, like a heartbeat, like something breathing underground. The scratching had grown louder. Oliver had ended the stream abruptly, packed his equipment with shaking hands, and driven back to Vancouver through the night, checking his mirrors every few minutes to make sure nothing was following him. But now, 3 days later, comments were still coming. Not from his regular subscribers. These accounts had no profile pictures, no previous comment history, no subscriber counts. Just names that sounded like they'd been pulled from mining records. Henderson, Kowalski, O'Brien, McDougal. Names that belonged to men who'd been buried under a mountain 37 years ago. "The light is coming back, Oliver. We found the way up. Tell them we're almost home." Each comment appeared at 3:33 a.m. Pacific Time, the exact moment the mine had collapsed on October 13th, 1987. Oliver tried deleting them, but they reappeared instantly. He tried blocking the accounts, but new ones simply took their place. He tried ignoring them entirely, but his phone would buzz every night at precisely the same time, demanding his attention. On the fourth night, the comments changed. "We know where you live, Oliver. Vancouver, apartment 412, corner unit with the broken fire escape. We're climbing now." Oliver's blood turned to ice water. Nobody knew his address. He was careful about that. YouTubers who shared too much personal information had a habit of attracting dangerous attention. He ran to his window and looked down at the street 4 stories below. Empty sidewalks. Parked cars. Normal city sounds that should have been comforting, but somehow felt threatening in the darkness. Then he saw them. 17 figures standing under the streetlight directly across from his building. They were too far away to make out details, but their shapes were wrong. Too tall, too thin, standing with the unnatural stillness of things that had forgotten how to be alive. As he watched, one of them raised its arm and pointed directly at his window. Oliver's phone buzzed. "Wave hello, Oliver. We can see you." His hands trembling, he backed away from the window and grabbed his camera. If something was happening to him, if he was losing his mind, or if something genuinely supernatural was occurring, he needed to document it. That's what he did. That's who he was. He hit record and whispered to the lens. "This is October 16th, 3:37 a.m. Something followed me back from Raven's Hollow Mine. I don't know what they want, but..." The lights went out. Not just in his apartment. The entire city block plunged into darkness, as if something had reached up from underground and torn the power lines from their poles. The only illumination came from his camera's LCD screen, casting ghostly shadows on his walls. In that pale blue glow, Oliver saw that he was no longer alone. They stood around his apartment, like statues carved from shadow and hunger. 17 figures in mining clothes that hadn't seen sunlight since 1987. Their faces were wrong, stretched and hollow, as if the mountain had sucked all the humanity out of them and left only the need to return to the surface. The one closest to him wore a hard hat with Henderson painted in faded letters. What had once been his mouth moved with the grinding sound of stone against stone. "You opened the door, Oliver. You brought us back." "I didn't. I never went underground. I stayed in the town. The town IS the mine now. Everything here belongs to US." Oliver looked around desperately and realized with growing horror that Henderson was right. The walls of his apartment were no longer drywall and paint. They were rough stone and timber supports. Mining equipment hung from hooks that hadn't been there moments before. The floor beneath his feet felt like packed earth and coal dust. Every October, the boundary grows weaker, Henderson continued, his voice echoing from impossible distances. Every year, we can reach a little further, touch a little more of the world above. But we needed someone to show us the way. Your camera was perfect, Oliver, like a lighthouse calling us home. Oliver's live stream equipment was still here, but now it was connected to cables that disappeared into the stone walls. The red recording light pulsed in rhythm with something deep underground, something that had been waiting 37 years for its chance to climb. What do you want? Oliver managed to whisper. Henderson smiled with a mouth full of cold dust and broken dreams. To finish our shift. The other miners began to move, their pickaxes gleaming in the camera's light. But they weren't advancing on Oliver. They were heading for what had once been his apartment door, but was now the entrance to a tunnel that stretched up into the world above. We've been digging for 37 years, Oliver. Every October, a little closer to the surface. Tonight we break through. Oliver watched in helpless fascination as the 17 miners began their march upward. Their tools sparked against the stone walls as they carved their way through solid matter as if it were soft earth. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, unstoppable. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Where are you going? He called after them. Henderson paused at the tunnel entrance and looked back with eyes like burnt coal. To visit everyone who's ever watched your videos, Oliver. To show them what real terror looks like. They wanted to see inside abandoned places. We'll show them what it's like to be abandoned. Underground. Forever. The camera was still recording. Oliver realized with dawning horror that his live stream had never actually ended. Somehow, impossibly, 847,000 subscribers were watching this happen in real time. The chat was exploding with comments, but they weren't his usual viewers anymore. Account after account with names from mining records across North America. Henderson, Kowalski, O'Brien, McDougal, and hundreds more. Miners who had died in cave-ins and explosions and floods from British Columbia to Pennsylvania to Wales to Australia. All of them awakening. All of them climbing. The network is bigger than you thought, Oliver, Henderson said. Every abandoned mine, every collapsed tunnel, every place where men died in darkness and were forgotten by the world above. We're all connected now. The comments kept coming, faster than Oliver could read them. Toronto. We're coming up through the subway tunnels. London. The old coal mines remember their way to the surface. Sydney. The copper mines are opening their eyes. Phoenix. The silver mines are breathing again. Oliver understood now why Raven's Hollow had been evacuated. It wasn't just about 17 trapped miners. It was about what they'd become in the darkness, what they'd learned to do, how they'd learned to spread. The mining industry had connected the world with tunnels and shafts and forgotten passages, a vast underground network that spanned continents. And Oliver's camera had been the final piece they needed, a way to reach through the internet into the homes and lives of everyone who'd ever watched his videos. Thank you, Oliver, Henderson said as he disappeared into the tunnel. You've helped us complete the greatest excavation in history. The sound of pickaxes grew fainter as the miners climbed toward the surface, but Oliver could hear other sounds now. Distant screams, car alarms, the rumble of things collapsing as the dead carved new passages through the foundations of cities worldwide. His phone buzzed one final time. The shift is over, Oliver. Time to go underground. The floor beneath his feet cracked, splintered, gave way. Oliver fell into darkness that smelled of coal dust and old bones, his camera still recording as he tumbled deeper into tunnels that had been waiting 37 years for fresh workers. Above him, 17 dead miners emerged into Vancouver streets and began their work. They had 847,000 addresses to visit, 847,000 people who'd invited them in by watching, who'd made themselves part of the network. The chat comments were already spreading to other social media platforms. Viral videos of impossible things climbing out of manholes and storm drains. Government websites crashing as officials try to respond to reports of synchronized emergencies across multiple continents. But it was too late. The last shift at Raven's Hollow Mine had finally ended. The first shift of something much larger had just begun. And deep underground, in tunnels that connected every dark place on Earth, Oliver Chin learned that some stories are never meant to end. They're meant to dig. Forever. The camera kept recording until the battery died. But by then, it didn't matter. The miners had found a new way to spread their story. Through every smartphone, every laptop, every device connected to the network that humanity had built without realizing what else might be listening in the dark spaces between the cables. The dead had always been patient. Now they had the whole world to excavate, one viewer at a time. The antique brass key felt unnaturally cold against Charlotte Thompson's palm as she stood before the weathered Victorian mansion that served as Black Hollow Village's only operational bed and breakfast. The October wind carried whispers through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 13 times, though Charlotte was certain it was only 7:30. "Are you absolutely certain about this, darling?" asked her husband James, his British accent thick with concern as he hefted their luggage from their rental car. The vehicle's headlights cast long, distorted shadows across the cobblestone path, making the carved gargoyles on the mansion's corners appear to writhe and shift. Charlotte's sister Victoria emerged from the passenger seat, her blonde hair whipping in the sudden gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The travel blog said this place offers the most authentic historical experience in all of New England, she said, though her voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. "Besides, we've already paid the deposit." Behind them, Victoria's husband Oliver, a tall, lanky Canadian photographer, was busy capturing shots of the village's main street with his expensive camera equipment. Through his lens, the abandoned storefronts and empty houses looked even more ominous, their dark windows staring back like hollow eye sockets. "Look at these architectural details," Oliver murmured, zooming in on the intricate woodwork that adorned every building. "It's like time stopped here over a century ago. The preservation is remarkable." What Oliver couldn't see through his camera was how the curtains in the supposedly empty houses occasionally twitched, or how shadows moved behind windows where no shadows should exist. The proprietor of the bed and breakfast, a gaunt woman named Mrs. Abernathy, appeared on the front porch as if she had been waiting for them. Her appearance was so sudden and silent that Charlotte jumped, nearly dropping the ornate key. "Welcome to Black Hollow Village," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice carrying an odd, hollow quality that seemed to echo despite the open air. "I trust your journey from Boston wasn't too eventful." "Actually, it was quite pleasant," James replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed their car for the last 20 miles of winding country road. "The GPS led us right here without any issues." Mrs. Abernathy's smile was thin and didn't reach her pale blue eyes. "How fortunate. Technology can be so unreliable in these parts. The old ways are often more dependable." As they approached the porch, Charlotte noticed that Mrs. Abernathy cast no reflection in the antique mirror that hung beside the front door. She blinked hard, convinced it was a trick of the lighting, but when she looked again, the same impossible sight greeted her. "Your rooms are prepared," Mrs. Abernathy continued, leading them into a foyer dominated by a grandfather clock that had stopped at 11:47. "Dinner will be served at 9 sharp. I do hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." The interior of the bed and breakfast was a marvel of Victorian excess, dark mahogany walls, Persian rugs, and oil paintings of stern-faced individuals whose eyes seemed to track their movement across the room. Charlotte found herself pausing before a particular portrait of a severe-looking man with penetrating dark eyes. "That's Ezekiel Blackthorne," Mrs. Abernathy said, appearing beside Charlotte with that same unnerving silence. "He was the town's founder and spiritual leader. Some say his presence still guides Black Hollow Village to this day." Victoria laughed nervously. "Well, he certainly looks the part of a fire and brimstone preacher." "Oh, Mr. Blackthorne was much more than that," Mrs. Abernathy replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He was a man of particular talents. the kind that allowed him to ensure his community would remain together, no matter what temporal inconveniences might arise. The words hung in the air like a funeral shroud, and Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. As Mrs. Abernathy led them up the creaking staircase to their rooms, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that the painted eyes of Ezekiel Blackthorne were following her every step. Their rooms were on the second floor, connected by a long hallway lined with more portraits. James and Charlotte were given the Rose Room, while Victoria and Oliver were assigned the Lily Room directly across the hall. The accommodations were luxurious in an old-world sense: four-poster beds with heavy curtains, antique armoires, and wash basins with ornate brass fixtures. "There's no television or telephone in the rooms," Mrs. Abernathy explained. "We find that modern conveniences tend to interfere with the authentic historical experience. However, there's a telephone in the main parlor should you need to contact the outside world." After Mrs. Abernathy departed, the four friends gathered in James and Charlotte's room to discuss their plans for the evening. "I've read that the village square is particularly atmospheric after dark," Victoria said, consulting a worn guidebook she'd purchased online. "Apparently, you can still hear the sounds of daily life from 1911, children playing, horses' hooves on cobblestones, that sort of thing." Oliver was examining his camera equipment with a frown. "That's odd. My batteries were fully charged when we arrived, but now they're reading nearly empty, and this memory card is showing as corrupted." "Old buildings can interfere with electronics," James suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own explanation. "The wiring might be causing electromagnetic issues." As if summoned by their conversation, the lights in the room began to flicker. For a moment, the elegant Victorian furnishings were replaced by different items: older, more primitive furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Charlotte caught a glimpse of what looked like children's toys scattered on the floor, but when the light steadied, everything was back to normal. "Did you all see that?" Charlotte whispered, her heart racing. "See what?" Victoria asked, but her pale complexion suggested she had seen something as well. Before anyone could respond, the dinner bell rang from somewhere deep within the house. The sound was rich and resonant, but it seemed to go on for far longer than any normal bell should ring. The dining room was a feast for the eyes: crystal chandeliers, fine china, and silver serving dishes that gleamed in the candlelight. Mrs. Abernathy had prepared what she called a traditional village meal: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables that tasted as if they had been harvested that very day. "The food is incredible," Oliver said between bites. "Where do you source such fresh ingredients? I didn't see any farms on our drive-in." "The village has always been self-sufficient," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "We have our own ways of ensuring that needs are met, just as we did in the old days." As they ate, Charlotte noticed that Mrs. Abernathy never touched her own food. She sat at the head of the table, watching her guests with an intensity that made Charlotte's skin crawl. Several times, Charlotte caught glimpses of other figures moving in the shadows at the edges of the dining room, but when she turned to look directly, nothing was there. "Tell us about the history of Black Hollow Village," James requested. "The overnight abandonment in 1911 is fascinating from a historical perspective." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Abandonment is such a harsh word. The people of Black Hollow simply transitioned to a different way of existence. You see, 1911 was a year of great change. The outside world was encroaching on our peaceful community. Modern ideas, modern ways of thinking, they threatened to destroy everything that made Black Hollow special." "But surely people don't just vanish overnight," Victoria pressed. "There must have been some explanation: disease, economic hardship, some kind of natural disaster?" "There was indeed a disaster of sorts," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "But it was a disaster of spirit rather than flesh. The good Reverend Blackthorne realized that the only way to preserve our community was to ensure that we would never be separated, never be forced to leave our beloved home." The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop several degrees, and Charlotte noticed that their breath was beginning to mist in the air. On the night of October 31st, 1911, Mrs. Abernathy continued, Reverend Blackthorne led the entire village in a special ceremony, a celebration of eternal unity. Every man, woman, and child participated willingly, joyfully even. They understood that by making this sacrifice, they would ensure that Black Hollow Village would remain forever as it was meant to be. Oliver had stopped eating and was staring at Mrs. Abernathy with undisguised horror. You're talking about mass suicide. I'm talking about mass transformation, Mrs. Abernathy corrected, her smile never wavering. The villagers didn't die, Mr. Morrison. They simply learned to exist in a different state of being. They became part of Black Hollow Village itself, eternal guardians of its peace and purity. The candles on the table began to flicker, and in their dancing light, Charlotte could see that the dining room was no longer empty except for their small group. Figures in old-fashioned clothing had materialized around the edges of the room. Men in suspenders and bow ties, women in long dresses with high collars, children in knickers and pinafores. All of them were staring at the four modern visitors with expressions of hungry anticipation. You see, Mrs. Abernathy said, rising from her chair, Black Hollow Village has been waiting patiently for new residents. The old families have grown, lonely over the decades. They're so eager to welcome you into their eternal community. James pushed back from the table, grabbing Charlotte's hand. We need to leave. Now. But when they turned toward the dining room door, it was no longer there. The walls had changed, becoming rough stone instead of wallpapered plaster. The elegant Victorian dining room had transformed into something much older and more primitive, an underground chamber lit by torches, with symbols carved into the stone walls that hurt to look at directly. There's no need to be frightened, Mrs. Abernathy said, though her appearance was changing as well. Her neat Victorian dress was becoming a flowing black robe, and her face was growing gaunt and hollow-eyed. The transition is quite painless. Reverend Blackthorne perfected the process over a century ago. Victoria screamed as the ghostly villagers began to close in around them. Their faces were no longer merely pale. They were translucent, showing glimpses of skull beneath rotting flesh. The children were the worst, their innocent faces twisted into expressions of malevolent glee as they reached out with fingers that ended in long, yellowed nails. Join us, they whispered in unison, their voices creating a horrible harmony that seemed to come from the very stones of the chamber. Stay with us forever. Become part of our eternal family. Oliver grabbed his camera, the flash firing wildly as he tried to document what was happening. But instead of capturing the horror around him, the camera's display showed only empty rooms and normal furniture. The digital screen couldn't register the supernatural reality they were experiencing. The camera can't see them, Oliver shouted over the growing chorus of ghostly voices. They exist outside normal perception. Charlotte felt cold fingers brush against her neck and spun around to find herself face to face with a young woman in a 1911-era dress. The ghost's eyes were completely black, and when she spoke, Charlotte could see that her mouth was filled with darkness instead of teeth. "Welcome home, sister," the apparition whispered. "We've been waiting so very long for you to arrive." James threw his arm around Charlotte, pulling her away from the ghostly woman. "There has to be a way out. Mrs. Abernathy brought us here through a normal door." "Mrs. Abernathy isn't Mrs. Abernathy," Victoria said, her voice shaking with terror. "Look at her." The woman who had served them dinner was no longer even remotely human in appearance. Her skin had become gray and mottled, hanging in loose folds from bones that were too long and too sharp. Her eyes had sunk deep into her skull, becoming glowing points of malevolent light. "I am the vessel through which Reverend Blackthorne's will is enacted," the creature said in a voice like grinding stone. "I have been calling suitable candidates to Black Hollow Village for decades, preparing them for their glorious transformation." The ghostly villagers were pressing closer now, their forms becoming more solid and threatening. Charlotte could feel their cold breath on her skin and smell the musty odor of grave earth that surrounded them. "What do you want from us?" James demanded. "We want you to complete our community." The creature that had been Mrs. Abernathy replied. For over a century, we have existed in a state of perfect preservation, but we are incomplete. We need fresh souls to join our eternal celebration, to bring new energy to our timeless existence. And if we refuse? Oliver asked, though he already knew the answer. The creature's laugh was like breaking glass. Refusal is not an option. The ceremony has already begun. Can't you feel it? The transformation is starting within you even now. Charlotte looked down at her hands and gasped in horror. Her skin was becoming pale and translucent, and she could see the faint outline of bones beneath the flesh. The same process was happening to the others. They were becoming ghosts themselves, trapped forever in the underground chamber that existed outside of normal time and space. Fight it, James shouted, grabbing Charlotte's increasingly ethereal hand. Don't let them take you. But the pull was incredibly strong. Charlotte could feel her consciousness being drawn into the collective existence of Black Hollow Village, her individual identity beginning to merge with the eternal community that Reverend Blackthorn had created over a century ago. Through the growing haze of transformation, she could see Ezekiel Blackthorn himself, standing at the far end of the chamber. He was tall and imposing, his dark robes flowing around him like living shadows. His eyes burned with fanatical fervor as he watched the 4 modern visitors being absorbed into his unholy congregation. Welcome, my children, Blackthorn intoned, his voice echoing through dimensions. Welcome to your eternal home. Here in Black Hollow Village, you will never know loneliness, never know separation, never know the pain of loss. You will be part of something greater than yourselves, a perfect community that exists outside the corruption of the modern world. Victoria was fighting the transformation with every ounce of her will, but Charlotte could see that her sister was losing the battle. Victoria's blonde hair was fading to gray, and her modern clothes were shifting into the long dress and high collar of a 1911 village woman. Charlotte, Victoria whispered, her voice already taking on the hollow quality of the other ghosts. I can feel them in my mind. Their memories, their thoughts. They're becoming part of me. Oliver had stopped struggling and was staring at his hands with a mixture of horror and fascination. It's not painful, he said wonderingly. It's almost peaceful, like coming home after a long journey. Don't listen to them, James shouted, but his own voice was becoming distant and ethereal. It's not real. It's not what we want. But the creature that had been Mrs. Abernathy was right. The transformation was already too far advanced to stop. Charlotte could feel the collective consciousness of Black Hollow Village flowing into her mind, bringing with it the memories and experiences of everyone who had lived and died in the village over the past century. She saw through the eyes of the original villagers as they willingly participated in Blackthorn's final ceremony, drinking from cups filled with a dark liquid that tasted of earth and copper. She felt their joy as they realized they would never have to leave their beloved home, their relief as they shed their mortal concerns and became part of something eternal and unchanging. As the transformation reached its completion, Charlotte found that her fear was fading, replaced by a sense of belonging that she had never experienced in life. The 4 modern visitors were no longer individuals. They were part of the eternal family of Black Hollow Village. Their consciousness merged with that of every soul who had chosen to make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of community. The underground chamber faded away, replaced by the familiar streets and buildings of the village. But now Charlotte could see it as it truly was, not an abandoned relic of the past, but a thriving community where time moved differently, where the seasons changed, but the people remained constant, where every day was a celebration of their eternal unity. Mrs. Abernathy, now restored to her human appearance, smiled at the 4 newest residents of Black Hollow Village. Welcome home, she said warmly. I know you'll be very happy here. We all are. And indeed, as Charlotte walked through the village streets with her new eternal family, she realized that Mrs. Abernathy was right. She was happy, happier than she had ever been in her mortal life. Here in Black Hollow Village, surrounded by kindred spirits who would never leave or betray or abandon her, she had found the perfect community that Reverend Blackthorn had promised over a century ago. The October wind still whispered through the ancient oaks, but now Charlotte understood what it was saying. It was singing the eternal song of Black Hollow Village, a lullaby of contentment and belonging that would continue forever and ever, welcoming new visitors who were ready to make the ultimate commitment to their new home. In the physical world, morning came to find the bed and breakfast empty, except for Mrs. Abernathy, who was already preparing for the next group of visitors. Their rental car remained parked in front of the Victorian mansion, but there was no sign of James, Charlotte, Victoria, or Oliver. The only evidence of their presence was a single photograph that Oliver's camera had somehow managed to capture, a group portrait showing 4 smiling people in old-fashioned clothing, standing in front of a church that hadn't existed for over a century. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, stood the tall figure of Reverend Ezekiel Blackthorne, his arms spread wide in eternal welcome. Mrs. Abernathy placed the photograph on the mantelpiece with dozens of others, each showing different groups of visitors who had found their way to Black Hollow Village over the years. Soon, she knew, new travelers would arrive, drawn by the same mysterious pull that had brought so many others to their eternal home. And in the village itself, Charlotte and her companions had already settled into their new existence. They attended the daily services in Blackthorne's church, participated in the communal meals, and joined in the evening celebrations that marked each perfect day in their timeless paradise. Sometimes, when new visitors arrived, Charlotte and the others would help Mrs. Abernathy welcome them, sharing stories of how wonderful life could be in a community where nobody ever had to say goodbye. They had become the very thing they had once feared, echoes of Black Hollow Village, eternal guardians of its peaceful perfection, forever calling out to lonely souls who were ready to find their true home. The transformation was complete, and Charlotte had never been happier to be wrong about what she thought she wanted from life. In Black Hollow Village, she had found something far better than happiness. She had found eternity itself. The ancient brass compass spun wildly in Captain Oliver Thompson's weathered hands as his research vessel, the Meridian Explorer, cut through the crimson waters of the Pacific. The needle refused to settle, dancing like a thing possessed as they approached the coordinates that shouldn't exist. "Captain," called out Dr. Victoria Ashford, her voice tight with unease as she studied the sonar readings. "The ocean floor here, it's not matching any of our charts. It's like the island just appeared." Thompson squinted through the morning haze at the dark silhouette rising from the sea. Isla Muerta, the island of the dead, a name whispered in the taverns of Cabos and Lucas by fishermen who crossed themselves when they spoke of it. According to their instruments, this place had been nothing but empty ocean just 6 months ago. "Impossible," muttered Professor James Blackwood, the maritime archaeologist who had organized this expedition. His pale fingers traced the ancient Spanish documents spread across the chart table. These records from 1542 describe a thriving monastery, hundreds of monks, and then nothing. Complete silence. The island loomed larger as they approached, its jagged cliffs rising like broken teeth from the churning waves. At its highest point, a single structure pierced the sky, a bell tower, its stone darkened by centuries of salt and storm. Even from this distance, they could see it was crumbling, yet it stood defiantly against the elements. "Look at those walls," whispered Dr. Catherine Wells, the marine biologist who had joined their team. Her Australian accent carried a tremor of fear. "They're covered in something, barnacles? But barnacles don't grow that far above the waterline." As the Meridian Explorer dropped anchor in the island's only harbor, a narrow inlet carved between towering rocks, the team prepared for their initial survey. The water here was an unnatural shade of green, so dark it seemed almost black in the shadows of the cliffs. "The diving equipment is ready," announced Hans Müller, their German technical specialist. "But I must warn you, the water temperature readings are peculiar. It's 30 degrees colder here than it should be, and there are currents that don't match any known patterns." Dr. Blackwood studied the tower through his binoculars, his academic excitement overriding his growing unease. "The architecture is definitely Spanish colonial, but those symbols carved into the stone, I've never seen anything like them. They're not Christian iconography." As evening approached, The team made camp on the small beach, the only flat ground they could find on the otherwise vertical island. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects. Not even the sound of waves lapping against the shore seemed quite right. The water moved with an odd, hypnotic rhythm, as if it were breathing. "Did anyone else notice there are no fish?" Victoria asked, poking at their campfire with a stick. The sonar showed nothing. "It's like the water around this place is dead." Hans checked his instruments again, frowning at the displays. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Something is interfering with our equipment. The radio's getting nothing but static, and the satellite phone won't connect." As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. The team huddled around their fire, but the flames seemed to burn lower than they should, casting twisted shadows that danced too wildly for the still air. "Tomorrow we dive," Blackwood declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Whatever happened here, the answers are below." The Spanish records mention chambers beneath the island, carved directly into the bedrock. Victoria pulled her jacket tighter. "What exactly are we looking for down there?" "Truth," Blackwood replied grimly. "The records speak of the monks' final days, strange rituals, voices from the deep, and something they called El Campanero, the bell ringer. The last entry in their logs mentions a great sacrifice to keep something imprisoned beneath the waves." The fire suddenly guttered, plunging them into near darkness. In that moment of blackness, they all heard it, a sound that made their blood freeze. Dong! The deep, resonant toll of a bell echoed across the water. "That's impossible," Hans whispered, checking his watch. "It's exactly midnight." They looked up at the tower, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. It stood empty and silent, yet the sound had definitely come from there. Dong! The second toll seemed to vibrate through their bones. Victoria grabbed her flashlight and aimed it at the tower, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness around the ancient structure. "The monks abandoned this place over 400 years ago," Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no one here to ring that bell." Dong! The third toll was followed by something that made them all step closer to their dying fire. A sound like stone grinding against stone, coming from the direction of the tower. Something was moving up there in the darkness. "We need to get off this island," Catherine said, backing toward their inflatable boat. "Now," but as she reached the water's edge, she stopped dead. The boat was still there, but the water around it was glowing with an eerie phosphorescence. And in that supernatural light, they could see shapes moving beneath the surface, tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that seemed to be climbing upward through the water. "Dear God," Oliver breathed. "They're coming up." The fourth toll of the bell was followed by a sound that would haunt their dreams forever, if they lived to have dreams again. A wet, scraping noise, like something massive dragging itself up the cliff face. Something that had been waiting beneath the waves. Something the Spanish monks had died, trying to keep imprisoned. The team stood frozen as the sounds grew closer, the glowing water beginning to lap higher on the beach with each passing second. Whatever was down there, whatever the bell was summoning, it had been waiting for centuries for someone to return to Isla Muerta. And now, as the ancient tower continued its midnight song, they realized with growing horror that they might not be visitors to this cursed place. They might be offerings. The bell tolled again, and this time they could see a dark figure silhouetted in the tower's arched opening, though no human could have climbed those crumbling walls. As they watched in terror, more shapes began to emerge from the phosphorescent water, moving with purpose toward the shore. The island of the dead had awakened, and it was hungry. Dong! The sixth toll echoed across the water as something that should not exist began its final ascent from the depths, drawn by the bell that had called to it across the centuries. And on the beach, 5 people who had come seeking answers realized they had found something far worse than ignorance. They had found the truth that some secrets are buried for a reason. The bell continued to ring, and with each toll, the darkness grew deeper, the water glowed brighter, and the shapes emerging from the depths grew more numerous. Isla Muerta was no longer just an island. It was a trap. And now it was sprung. The photograph had arrived without explanation, slipped under Professor William Henderson's office door at Oxford University on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Black and white, edges yellowed with age, it showed a carnival frozen in time, rusted Ferris wheels reaching toward an overcast Ukrainian sky, carousel horses with paint peeling like dead skin, and something else that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the image, barely visible through the morning mist, stood a figure that shouldn't have been there. A figure he recognized, his brother Thomas, who had disappeared in Chernivka 43 years ago. Henderson's hands trembled as he studied every detail of the impossible photograph. The postmark was recent, the paper fresh, but Thomas looked exactly as he had in 1981, 24 years old, wearing the same faded denim jacket he'd worn the day he vanished while researching Soviet-era entertainment sites for his anthropology thesis. "Impossible," Henderson whispered, the word echoing in his empty office like a prayer. 3 days later, Henderson found himself boarding a train in Kiev with an unlikely group of companions. Dr. Isabelle Laurent from the Sorbonne, a folklore specialist who'd received an identical photograph showing her missing colleague from 1987. James Morrison, a paranormal investigator from Edinburgh whose sister had vanished in the same region 5 years prior. And Dr. Klaus Weber from Munich, a historian whose grandfather had helped build the carnival in 1952 and never returned from his final inspection. The train carved through the Ukrainian countryside as storm clouds gathered overhead. Each passenger clutched their mysterious photograph, studying faces that should have aged, should have changed, should have been dead. The carnival was commissioned by Soviet officials as a symbol of progress, Weber explained, his German accent thick with unease. My grandfather's letters spoke of strange incidents during construction. Workers would arrive in the morning to find rides assembled that no one remembered building. Equipment would appear overnight with no record of delivery. Laurent consulted her research notes with shaking fingers. Local folklore mentions the site was built over an ancient burial ground. The indigenous Slavic tribes believed it was a threshold between worlds, a place where the boundaries grew thin during certain times of the year. Morrison's investigative equipment beeped continuously as they traveled deeper into rural Ukraine. My instruments have been going crazy since we crossed into this region. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts, and we're still 50 kilometers away. The train shuddered to a halt at a station that wasn't on any map. The conductor, a gaunt man with eyes like winter fog, gestured toward the door with urgency. "This is as far as the rails go," he said in broken English. "You walk from here. But I warn you, come back before the church bells ring midnight, or you won't come back at all." The 4 travelers gathered their equipment and stepped onto the platform as the train pulled away with indecent haste, leaving them alone in the gathering darkness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant creaking of metal in the wind. A dirt path led through twisted trees toward a glow on the horizon that shouldn't have existed in this empty wilderness. With each step, the air grew colder, thicker, charged with electricity that made their skin crawl and their hearts race. Then they saw it. The Chernivka carnival rose from the mist like a fever dream made manifest. Rusted attractions stretched into the darkness, a Ferris wheel that groaned despite having no motor, bumper cars with no power source that somehow still sparked and moved, a funhouse whose mirrors reflected things that weren't there. But most terrifying of all were the people. Dozens of figures wandered between the attractions, their movements jerky and unnatural, their clothes spanning decades of fashion. They all shared the same characteristic. They appeared exactly as they had on the day they disappeared, untouched by time, unchanged by age or death. "Thomas," Henderson called out, spotting his brother near the carousel. Thomas turned, and Henderson's scream died in his throat. His brother's eyes were black pits, endless and hungry. When Thomas smiled, his teeth were sharp as broken glass. "Welcome home, William," Thomas said in a voice like grinding metal. "We've been waiting for you to join the show." The carnival burst into life around them. Lights blazed from every attraction. Calliope music screeched through the air, and the ground began to vibrate with impossible energy. The disappeared people turned toward the four travelers, their movements perfectly synchronized, their eyes reflecting the hellish glow. Weber pulled out his grandfather's journal with desperate hands. He wrote about this in his final entry. The carnival isn't just built on a threshold. It is the threshold. It feeds on those who come looking for the lost, trapping them in an eternal performance for whatever watches from the other side. Lawrence's folklore research suddenly made terrible sense. The burial ground wasn't just any cemetery. It was a sacrificial site. The ancient tribes didn't just bury their dead here. They offered them to something that exists between dimensions. The carnival is just a modern form of an ancient hunger. Morrison's equipment screamed with readings that shouldn't have been possible. The electromagnetic signature is identical to documented interdimensional phenomena. We're not dealing with ghosts. We're dealing with something that exists partially outside our reality, something that uses the appearance of our loved ones to lure us in. The carousel began to spin faster, its painted horses now moving with organic fluidity, their eyes alive and aware. Thomas stepped closer, his form flickering between the brother Henderson remembered and something far more terrible. "Don't you want to see him again, William?" Thomas asked, extending a hand that shifted between flesh and shadow. "Don't you want to understand where he went? All you have to do is take my hand, and you'll never be alone again. You'll never lose anyone again. You'll all be together forever." Henderson felt the terrible pull of 43 years of grief and guilt. Beside him, Lauren reached toward a figure that looked like her missing colleague. Weber stepped toward his grandfather's beckoning form, and Morrison moved toward his sister's impossible smile. But as Henderson's fingers nearly touched his brother's outstretched hand, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. In the reflection of the carousel mirrors, Thomas cast no shadow. None of the carnival people did. They were projections, lures, bait for something vast and hungry that waited just beyond the veil of reality. "Run!" Henderson screamed, grabbing his companions and pulling them away from their loved one's false embrace. The carnival erupted in fury. The Ferris wheel spun like a massive buzz saw, shooting sparks into the night sky. The funhouse began to fold in on itself, its mirrors shattering into silver fragments that hung in the air like suspended time. The disappeared people moved as one, pursuing the fleeing travelers with inhuman speed and desperate hunger. Behind them, something roared, a sound like reality tearing, like the scream of whatever dwelt in the spaces between worlds and had been denied its feast. They ran through the forest as the ground shook and the sky above them rippled like water. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, trying to block their path. The very air fought against their escape, growing thick as honey, heavy as lead. Lauren stumbled, her ankle caught in roots that moved like living things. The others turned back, but she waved them on. "Go. Don't let it take all of us. Someone has to warn others." As Weber helped her to her feet, Morrison's equipment detected massive energy spikes approaching from behind. "It's following us. The whole dimensional boundary is destabilizing." They burst from the forest, just as the church bells, in a distant village, began to toll midnight. The sound seemed to drive back the pursuing darkness, creating a barrier of sacred resonance that the carnival's hunger couldn't cross. Behind them, the glow on the horizon flickered and died. The unnatural sounds faded to whispers, then to nothing. When they turned back, the forest looked normal again, peaceful even. But they all knew the carnival was still there, still waiting, still hungry. 3 days later, they sat in Henderson's Oxford office, comparing notes and trying to make sense of their narrow escape. Each had left a piece of themselves in that place. Weber walked with a limp. Lauren's hair had turned white at the temples. Morrison's equipment would never work properly again, and Henderson could no longer look at photographs without seeing shadows where there should be none. But they had escaped, and they had learned the truth. The Chernivka Carnival was more than a trap. It was a feeding ground for entities that existed in the spaces between realities, using the deepest human emotions as bait to sustain themselves on human consciousness. Weber sealed his grandfather's journal in his university's vault, adding his own warning to the final pages. Lauren published her folklore research, disguised as academic theory, hoping to warn others without revealing the full truth. Morrison destroyed most of his equipment and retired from paranormal investigation, but not before creating a network of warnings for others who might follow similar paths. And Henderson? He locked the impossible photograph in his desk drawer, but sometimes, late at night, he would hear carousel music drifting through his office windows and see Thomas standing in the shadows of the courtyard below, still waiting, still calling him home. The carnival remembered everyone who escaped its embrace, and it was patient. It had waited centuries before the Soviet officials built their symbol of progress over its ancient hunger. It could wait a little longer. But sometimes, on nights when the boundary between worlds grows thin, travelers in rural Ukraine report seeing lights on the horizon where no lights should be. They hear laughter echoing through empty forests, and calliope music carried on winds that taste of rust and time. And sometimes, if they're very unlucky, they recognize the voices calling their names from within that distant glow, voices of those they thought they'd lost forever, promising reunions that will last for all eternity. The Chernivka Carnival never truly closes. It's always ready for the next show. The engine of Jake's Mustang roared through the vast Arizona desert as the sun painted the horizon in deep crimson. What started as a simple college reunion road trip had taken an unexpected turn when Olivia spotted something peculiar on her vintage map collection. There's supposed to be an old mining town called Rattlesnake Pass somewhere around here, she announced from the passenger seat, her British accent cutting through the wind. It's marked on this 1950s map, but completely absent from modern ones. In the back seat, Thomas from Toronto adjusted his glasses nervously. Maybe there's a reason it's not on current maps. Don't be such a pessimist, laughed Chloe, the Australian exchange student who'd become their unofficial adventure coordinator. Ghost towns are fascinating pieces of history. Jake, their American driver, glanced in the rearview mirror at their fourth companion, Pierre from Montreal, who had been unusually quiet. What do you think, Pierre? Worth a detour. Pierre shrugged, his French-Canadian drawl barely audible over the engine. Adventure finds those who seek it, mon ami. As they crested a small hill, Olivia suddenly pointed ahead. There, do you see it? A weathered, rusted sign emerged from the desert haze. Welcome T.O. Rattlesnake Pass, population 847, established 1892. The numbers looked fresh despite the sign's obvious age, as if someone had recently repainted them. The road beyond the sign was cracked asphalt that seemed to shimmer in the dying light. Ancient telephone poles lined the route, their wires long since snapped and dangling like broken spiderwebs. The population sign bothers me, Thomas muttered. Who's been maintaining it out here? Jake slowed the car as they passed the welcome sign. The moment they crossed that invisible threshold, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The radio, which had been playing classic rock, suddenly filled with static before going completely silent. Weird, Chloe said, fiddling with the dial. We had perfect reception a minute ago. The road curved ahead, and soon they could see the outline of buildings against the darkening sky. Rattlesnake Pass wasn't large. Maybe 24 structures scattered along what had once been Main Street. Most were in various states of decay, but few seemed surprisingly well preserved. Look at that, Olivia breathed. It's like time just stopped. A flickering neon sign caught their attention. Pete's Gas and Go, cold drinks, last chance. The sign buzzed intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the empty street. Jake pulled up to the gas station. The building was small and square, with 2 ancient pumps out front that looked like they hadn't worked in decades. Yet the interior lights were on, casting a warm yellow glow through dust-covered windows. Should we go in? Pierre asked, his voice carrying an odd tension. Why not? Jake turned off the engine. Maybe someone can tell us about this place. They climbed out of the car, and immediately noticed how silent everything was. No wind, no insects, no distant highway noise. Just nothing. The gas station door opened with a rusty creak. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating rows of vintage snack foods and beverages. Everything looked like it belonged in the 1950s, glass Coca-Cola bottles, candy bars with unfamiliar packaging, newspapers with headlines about Eisenhower. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with deeply lined skin and pale blue eyes. He looked up as they entered, his face breaking into a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to Rattlesnake Pass," he said in a gravelly voice. "Name's Pete. Don't get many visitors these days." "Hi," Jake said cautiously. "We were just passing through and saw your town. It's not on any of our modern maps." Pete chuckled, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Maps change, son. Towns don't always change with them. You folks need gas, snacks, cold drinks." "Actually," Olivia interjected, "we were hoping to look around town a bit, learn some history." "History?" Pete's smile widened. "Oh, this place has plenty of history. Feel free to explore. Just remember, sun goes down fast in the desert. You'll want to be careful driving at night." Something in his tone made Thomas shift uncomfortably. "We should probably head back to the main highway soon." "Of course." Pete nodded agreeably. "Main road's right where you left it. Can't miss it." They bought some drinks and snacks, paying with cash since Pete claimed his card reader was on the fritz. As they left the store, Chloe noticed something odd. Did anyone else see those newspapers? They all had dates from the 1950s, but they looked fresh, like they were printed yesterday. "And did you notice how Pete never blinked?" Thomas added, "Not once during our entire conversation." Jake jingled his keys. "You guys are being paranoid. It's just a weird old desert town. Let's take a quick look around and then head out." They walked down Main Street as darkness fell. The buildings were a mix of abandoned storefronts and homes, most with broken windows and sagging roofs. But several showed signs of recent activity: swept porches, clean windows, even a few with lights on inside. "Someone's definitely living here," Pierre observed. "But where is everyone?" As if summoned by his words, figures began appearing. First one, then another, emerging from doorways and alleys. All appeared to be dressed in clothing from decades past. All had the same pale, unblinking eyes as Pete. "Good evening," called a woman in a 1950s house dress. "Welcome to Rattlesnake Pass. Lovely night for a visit." "Beautiful evening," agreed a man in suspenders and a fedora. "You folks staying long?" More residents appeared, all smiling, all speaking in cheerful voices that somehow sounded hollow. They formed a loose circle around the five friends, not threatening, but definitely blocking their easy retreat to the car. "We should go," Thomas whispered urgently. Jake nodded, forcing a smile at the gathering crowd. "Thanks for the hospitality, but we really need to get back on the road." "Of course," the woman in the house dress said. "Safe travels. Do come back soon." The crowd parted, allowing them to return to the gas station. Jake started the Mustang quickly, reversing away from the pumps and heading back toward the main road. But when they reached the spot where they'd entered town, the road simply curved. Instead of leading back to the highway, it wound around and deposited them right back at Pete's Gas and Go. "What the hell?" Jake hit the brakes. "That's impossible." "Try again," Chloe said, her voice tight with growing panic. "Maybe we missed a turn." Jake turned the car around and drove more slowly this time, watching carefully for any side roads or turns they might have missed. But the result was the same. Every road led them back to the gas station. "This is impossible," Olivia said, studying her maps frantically. "Roads don't just loop like this." Pete emerged from the gas station, that same unsettling smile on his face. "Having trouble finding your way? Desert roads can be tricky at night." "The road keeps bringing us back here," Jake called through the window. "Which way is the highway?" "Same way you came in, son. Just keep driving straight." Pete pointed down the road they'd already tried 3 times. Thomas leaned forward from the back seat. "Something's very wrong here. We need to find another way out." They tried every possible route, side streets, alleys, even driving across the desert itself. But no matter which direction they went, every path eventually curved back to that same broken-down gas station where Pete waited with his knowing smile. Hours passed. The gas gauge dropped steadily. The desert night grew colder. "We're running out of fuel," Jake announced grimly. "And I don't think those pumps work." "Actually," Pete called out, apparently hearing him despite the distance, "pumps work just fine. Fill her up." They had no choice. Jake pulled up to the pumps, and to everyone's surprise, they functioned perfectly. The gas flowed freely. The numbers on the pump rolled normally, and Pete accepted their payment with that same unchanging smile. "There you go," he said cheerfully. "Full tank. That should get you wherever you need to go." But it didn't. They drove for what felt like hours, watching the odometer climb, yet they never seemed to get anywhere. Every road, every turn, every desperate attempt to escape led them back to Pete's gas and go. Dawn began to break over the desert, painting the sky in pale colors that seemed somehow wrong, too bright, too artificial, like a painted backdrop. "Look at the sun," Pierre said quietly. "It's rising in the same place it set." He was right. The sun was coming up in the west, defying every law of nature they knew. "We're not in Arizona anymore," Olivia whispered. "I don't think we're anywhere real." As the impossible sunrise continued, they noticed something else disturbing. The buildings in Rattlesnake Pass were exactly the same as they'd been the night before. No wear, no weathering, no change at all. Even the dust patterns on the windows were identical. And there was Pete, standing outside his gas station with that same welcoming smile, as if he'd never moved, never slept, never done anything but wait for their return. "Morning, folks," he called out. "Ready for another beautiful day in Rattlesnake Pass." The five friends looked at each other with growing horror. They were trapped in a town that didn't exist, on roads that led nowhere, under a sun that rose in the wrong direction. And Pete's smile never wavered, never changed, as if he knew exactly what they were beginning to understand, that some places, once you find them, never let you leave. The gas gauge read full again, despite hours of driving. The radio played nothing but static, and ahead of them stretched the same endless road that would always, inevitably, lead them back to where they started. "Welcome to Rattlesnake Pass. Population 847, and counting." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with black wax and bearing no return address. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, renowned paranormal investigator from London, held the parchment with trembling fingers as he read the elegant script that would change his life forever. "Professor Whitmore, your reputation precedes you. I require your expertise regarding Frostwick Manor in the Scottish Highlands. The property has remained untouched since the fire of 1847. Recent developments suggest something has awakened within those walls. Payment is substantial. Come alone. VM." Enclosed was a check for £50,000. 3 days later, Whitmore's Range Rover crunched over the frozen gravel path leading to what remained of Frostwick Manor. The Gothic structure loomed against the gray Highland sky like a wounded giant, its blackened stone walls reaching toward heaven in silent accusation. Windows gaped like hollow sockets, their glass long since shattered by decades of Highland storms. The air itself seemed wrong here. It pressed against his chest with an almost physical weight, carrying whispers of ancient suffering that made his teeth ache. Even in broad daylight, shadows moved independently of their sources, sliding across snow-covered ground with predatory intent. Whitmore stepped from his vehicle, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. The temperature gauge in his car read -15°C, but the cold here penetrated deeper than mere winter chill. It was the cold of the grave, the cold of abandonment, the cold of something that should have died long ago but refused to rest. As he approached the main entrance, his footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and transformed by the very stones beneath his feet. The massive oak doors hung askew on rusted hinges, revealing a yawning mouth of absolute darkness beyond. "Dr. Whitmore?" The voice made him spin around, his heart hammering against his ribs. A tall woman in an expensive coat emerged from behind a cluster of dead trees, her blonde hair whipping in the Highland wind. She appeared to be in her 40s, with sharp Nordic features and eyes the color of winter ice. I am Victoria Morgenstern, she said, extending a gloved hand. Thank you for coming. Her accent was difficult to place, perhaps Scandinavian, with traces of something older, something that belonged to no modern nation. When their hands met, Whitmore felt a jolt of electric cold that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest like a frozen fist. You wrote to me about recent developments, Whitmore said, withdrawing his hand quickly. What exactly has changed? Victoria's smile was winter itself, beautiful and utterly without warmth. 3 weeks ago, a group of teenagers from Glasgow broke into the manor on a dare. Only one survived. Cameron MacLeod, age 17. He's been in psychiatric care ever since, speaking of bleeding walls and voices that call from inside the stone. She gestured toward the ruins with one elegant hand. The local authorities believe it was hypothermia-induced hallucination. But you and I know better, don't we, Doctor? Whitmore studied her face, noting the way shadows seemed to cling to her features, despite the afternoon sun. What happened to the other teenagers? Found them 3 days later, Victoria replied, her voice carrying the casual tone one might use to discuss the weather. Frozen solid in the cellar. But here's what the police haven't released to the public. They were found smiling, Dr. Whitmore. All 3 of them. Frozen smiles on their faces, and their eyes. She paused, savoring the moment. Their eyes were gone. Not torn out. Not damaged. Simply absent. The wind picked up, howling through the broken stones with a sound that resembled nothing so much as distant laughter. Whitmore felt his professional skepticism warring with the primal instinct that screamed at him to leave this place, to drive back to London and never speak of Frostwick Manor again. The original fire, he said instead, forcing his voice to remain steady. Tell me about it. Victoria began walking toward the manor, her heels clicking against the frozen ground in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. Lord Alistair Frostwick was an unusual man, collected artifacts from around the world, dark artifacts, summoned things that should have remained in whatever hell spawned them. As they walked, Whitmore noticed that the snow around the manor was stained a deep russet color, as if the earth itself was bleeding upward through the white crystal carpet. The fire started in the east wing on Christmas Eve, 1847. Victoria continued. 17 guests were staying for the holidays. Lord Frostwick's wife, Magdalene, their twin daughters Isabella and Cordelia, plus various relatives and friends from across Europe. The Andersons from Edinburgh, the Berkshire family from London, the Van der Bergs from Amsterdam. She paused at the threshold of the manor, one hand resting on the splintered doorframe. None of them escaped, but according to the survivors from the village below, the screaming didn't stop when the flames died. It continued for 3 days and 3 nights, long after any human throat should have been reduced to ash. Whitmore pulled out his digital recorder and notepad, the familiar ritual of documentation helping to steady his nerves. Survivors? I thought everyone in the manor died. Everyone in the manor, yes, but Lord Frostwick's manservant, Thomas Grimsby, was in the village that night, drinking at the local pub. He heard the screams. More importantly, he saw what happened after the fire died. Victoria stepped across the threshold, and immediately the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Their breath became thick white clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than natural physics would allow. According to Grimsby's testimony, recorded before he threw himself from Edinburgh Bridge a week later, the shapes moved through the smoke. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. Tall and twisted, with too many limbs and faces that shifted like melting wax. The interior of Frostwick Manor was a cathedral of destruction. Charred beams stretched overhead like the ribs of some massive beast, and the walls were covered in a substance that looked disturbingly like dried blood, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The local church buried Grimsby's testimony, Victoria said, her voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. But I have connections. I've read his account. On the second night after the fire, he claimed to see lights moving through the ruins, candles that burned with green flame, carried by figures that cast no shadows. Whitmore began setting up his equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, digital voice recorders calibrated to pick up sounds below human hearing. Each device seemed to struggle in this place, their displays flickering erratically. "Why now?" he asked, adjusting a particularly temperamental EMF detector. "If this place has been haunted for over a century and a half, why are things escalating?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Because something is waking up, Dr. Whitmore. Something that has been sleeping in the stone and bone of this place, feeding on the agony soaked into every brick and beam." As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed through the manor, a wet, sliding noise, like something massive dragging itself across wet stone. Both of them froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversation in a language that predated human speech. "The walls," Victoria whispered, pointing toward the east wing. "Look at the walls." Where moments before there had been only dried stains and soot-blackened stone, now there were fresh red streaks, gleaming wet in the pale afternoon light, filtering through the broken roof. The substance ran down the walls in perfect vertical lines, pooling on the floor in crimson puddles that reflected no light. "Blood," Whitmore breathed, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. "But from where? There's no source, no." His words died as he noticed the patterns. The blood wasn't flowing randomly. It was forming shapes, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. Ancient markings that spoke of binding and summoning and things that should never have been given form in the mortal world. "Dr. Whitmore," Victoria said, her voice carrying an odd, sing-song quality that raised the hair on the back of his neck. "Do you know what Lord Frostwick was trying to accomplish in his final experiment?" The bleeding intensified, the walls now weeping red tears that splashed audibly onto the stone floor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, speaking in tongues that predated civilization. "He was trying to open a door," Victoria continued, and now Whitmore could see that her breath wasn't forming clouds anymore. The air around her was completely still, as if she existed in a pocket of absolute vacuum, a door between this world and somewhere else. Somewhere hungry. The temperature plummeted so suddenly that frost began forming on Whitmore's equipment. His EMF detector began shrieking, its needle buried deep in the red zone. The thermal cameras showed nothing but absolute cold, temperature readings that violated the laws of physics. "The fire didn't destroy Lord Frostwick's work," Victoria said, and now her voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing from the bleeding walls themselves. "It completed it. The pain and terror of those final moments, the agony of 17 souls dying in unimaginable suffering, it was all the fuel the ritual needed." Whitmore backed toward the entrance, his hands fumbling for his car keys. But when he looked over his shoulder, the doorway was no longer there. Instead, he saw only more bleeding walls, more impossible symbols forming in fresh red liquid. "You see, Dr. Whitmore," Victoria continued, and when he turned back to face her, she was floating 3 feet above the ground, her winter coat billowing around her like great dark wings. "I didn't bring you here to investigate Frostwick Manor." Her face was changing, elongating, her features becoming sharp and predatory. Her eyes had become pools of absolute darkness, and when she smiled, her teeth were like broken glass. "I brought you here to feed it." The walls began to pulse, like the chambers of some massive heart. The blood flowed faster now, cascading from ceiling in red waterfalls, and in the sound of that crimson rain, Whitmore could hear them, the voices of everyone who had ever died in this cursed place. Lord Frostwick's cultured British accent. "The door must be opened." Magdalene Frostwick's soprano scream. "The children, save the children." Young Isabella's terrified whisper. "Mama, why won't the shadows stop moving?" Cordelia's broken sob. "It's so cold, so very cold." The Anderson family from Edinburgh, the Berkshires from London, the Van der Bergs from Amsterdam, all of them speaking at once, their voices blending into a chorus of eternal suffering. "They're trapped here," Victoria said, her voice now a symphony of harmonics that resonated in Whitmore's bones. Bound to this place by pain and terror, but they hunger for release. They hunger for company. Whitmore pulled out his phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen showed only static. The device was so cold it burned his fingers, and when he dropped it, it shattered like glass against the blood-slicked stones. "No one can hear you, Dr. Whitmore." Victoria laughed, and the sound was like wind through a graveyard. "We are beyond the reach of your world now. This place exists in the between, in the spaces where reality grows thin." The bleeding walls began to move, the stone itself rippling like water. Shapes pressed outward from within the rock. Human faces twisted in eternal agony, hands reaching desperately toward freedom that would never come. "Join us," they whispered in unison. "Join us in the crimson dark. Join us in the endless cold." Whitmore ran then, crashing through the pooled blood, his feet slipping on the treacherous stones. But every corridor he entered led back to the same room. Every doorway opened onto the same bleeding walls and reaching shadows. The manor was alive now, its stone heart beating with a rhythm that matched his own terrified pulse. The walls breathed, expanding and contracting, and with each breath they bled more freely, painting the air crimson. "There is no escape." Victoria's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "There never was. This place is hungry, Dr. Whitmore. It has been hungry for so very long." As the sun set over the Scottish Highlands, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of blood and shadow, the last light faded from the windows of Frostwick Manor. From within came the sound of fresh screaming, educated, articulate screaming that spoke of a man who understood exactly what was happening to him. By midnight, even those sounds had faded. The next morning, search and rescue teams found Whitmore's abandoned Range Rover, its engines still running, driver's door hanging open. They found his equipment scattered across the snow, broken and twisted as if by enormous pressure. But they never found Dr. Jonathan Whitmore. The locals in the village below still speak of that night, though only in whispers and only when the highland mist rolls thick enough to hide their words. They say that sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, you can still hear him calling from within those accursed walls, calling for help that will never come, calling for release from suffering that will never end. And if you're foolish enough to venture close to Frostwick Manor on such nights, they say you might see them through the broken windows, all of them, everyone who ever entered those bleeding walls and never left. Lord Frostwick and his family, the teenage victims, Thomas Grimsby, and now Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, all of them trapped forever in Victoria Morgenstern's carefully laid trap, all of them bleeding into the very stones of that cursed place, all of them waiting for the next curious soul to answer their invitation. The manor still stands, its walls still weep, and somewhere in the mist-shrouded highlands of Scotland, Victoria Morgenstern is already preparing her next letter. After all, the door is almost fully open now. It just needs a few more souls to complete the unlocking. And there are so many curious people in the world. So very many indeed. The antique brass key felt unnaturally cold against Professor James Whitmore's palm as he stood before the rusted iron gate of St. Eloi Cathedral. The structure loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a broken tooth, its Gothic spires twisted and blackened by the bombs that had fallen 70 years ago. Rain hammered against the ancient stones, creating rivulets that looked disturbingly like tears of blood in the lightning's brief illumination. "You absolutely certain about this, James?" Dr. Catherine Mills adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, her Australian accent cutting through the howling wind. "The locals in the village won't even speak about this place after sunset." James turned the key slowly, feeling the mechanism resist as if the lock itself was reluctant to yield its secrets. "The research grant depends on documenting the acoustic anomalies, Catherine. Besides, we're men of science. We don't believe in ghost stories." The gate opened with a shriek that seemed to harmonize with the wind, and the four-person research team stepped into the cathedral's shadow. Behind Catherine came Dr. Oliver Hartwell from London, his expensive equipment cases clutched protectively against his chest, and Dr. Vivian Cross from Toronto, whose pale face had grown even whiter since they'd arrived in this forgotten corner of France. The cathedral's nave stretched before them like the ribcage of some massive beast. Moonlight filtered through the few remaining stained-glass windows, casting fragments of colored light across the debris-strewn floor. Carved angels watched from the walls with eyeless sockets, their wings spread in what might have been protection or warning. "The acoustic readings are already off the charts," Oliver whispered, adjusting his sensitive equipment. "There's something down there generating subsonic frequencies that shouldn't exist in a structure this old." Vivian pointed toward a section of the floor where the stone tiles formed an unusual pattern. According to the 12th century manuscripts, the entrance to the crypt should be beneath that rose window carving. As if responding to her words, a section of the floor began to glow with the faint, phosphorescent light. The carved roses seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and beneath their feet, they could hear it, a sound so beautiful and terrifying that it made their souls ache. Voices, not just any voices, but a choir singing in perfect harmony. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling like ocean waves, but there was something fundamentally wrong about it. The voices were too pure, too perfect, as if they belonged to beings that had never known the corruption of human flesh. "That's impossible," James breathed, kneeling beside the glowing stones. "There's no power source down there. This cathedral has been abandoned for decades." The singing grew louder, and now they could distinguish individual voices within the choir. Soprano voices that climbed to impossible heights, bass notes that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth, and harmonies that created overtones their human ears weren't designed to process. Oliver's equipment began to malfunction, needles spinning wildly across gauges that had never registered readings this extreme. The frequency analysis is showing vocal ranges that exceed human capability by over 200%. Whatever's singing down there, it's not entirely human. Catherine grabbed James's arm as the rose window carving began to sink into the floor, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The choir's voices grew more insistent, more seductive, calling to them with wordless melodies that promised secrets beyond mortal comprehension. "We should document this," James said, though his voice shook with barely contained fear. "This could be the archaeological discovery of the century." "Or our deaths," Vivian whispered, but she was already moving toward the entrance. The stairs were carved from black stone that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. As they descended, the temperature dropped with each step, and their breath began to mist in the increasingly frigid air. The walls were covered with carvings that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally, and symbols that belonged to no known human language. "The acoustics down here are impossible," Oliver said, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow passage. "The sound should dissipate, but it's getting stronger. It's as if the stone itself is amplifying the voices." 20 steps down, they found the first skeleton. It was perfectly preserved, sitting against a wall in a position of peaceful repose, wearing the remnants of a Wehrmacht uniform. The German soldier's skull was tilted back, as if he had been listening to something beautiful when death had claimed him. "World War II," James observed, carefully photographing the remains. He must have discovered this place during the occupation. 10 steps further, they found more bones. French resistance fighters, their weapons still clutched in their skeletal hands. American GIs from the liberation, British commandos, Soviet scouts, all sitting in the same peaceful positions, all facing deeper into the darkness, where the singing continued to grow stronger. "They all came down here," Catherine realized with growing horror. Over the decades, over the centuries, they heard the singing and they came down here, and they never left. The staircase ended at a massive chamber carved from living rock. The ceiling disappeared into shadows that their lights couldn't penetrate, and the walls were lined with thousands of alcoves, each containing the remains of those who had answered the choir's call. Knights in rusted mail, pilgrims with their staff and shells, revolutionary soldiers, Napoleon's Grande Army. Each generation that had passed through this region had lost souls to whatever sang in the darkness beneath Street Aloy. At the center of the chamber sat a circle of 13 stone chairs, each one occupied by a figure that was neither alive nor completely dead. Their bodies were perfectly preserved, but translucent, and their mouths moved in the eternal song that filled the air with its impossible beauty. "Medieval priests," James whispered, recognizing the remnants of their vestments. They must have been the original choir. The spectral figures turned their heads in unison, acknowledging the living visitors with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom and madness of centuries. Their song never faltered, but now it seemed directed specifically at the 4 researchers, calling them forward. Oliver's equipment finally failed completely, sparking and smoking in the presence of energies that defied scientific measurement. "The electromagnetic readings are impossible," he gasped. "This place exists partially outside normal space-time." Vivian took a step toward the singing priests, her face slack with wonder and terror. "The harmonies," she whispered. "I can hear the mathematical perfection in every note. It's like the universe singing to itself." "Don't listen too closely," Catherine warned, but she was fighting the same compulsion. The choir's voices seemed to reach directly into their minds, promising revelations that mortal consciousness wasn't meant to contain. The ghostly priests raised their hands in welcome, and their song shifted to a new key that resonated in the living researchers' very bones. Ancient Latin phrases echoed through the chamber, but the words were wrong, corrupted into something that predated Christianity by millennia. "They're not singing hymns," James realized with dawning horror. "They're singing a summoning." The shadows at the far end of the chamber began to coalesce into shapes that hurt to perceive directly. Things that existed in the spaces between notes, in the silence between heartbeats, in the darkness between thoughts. The true source of the choir's eternal song was stirring, drawn by the presence of living minds to corrupt and consume. "We have to leave," Catherine said, but her feet wouldn't obey her mind. The song had woven itself into her nervous system, making her body a puppet to the choir's ancient will. Oliver laughed, a sound devoid of sanity as he walked toward the circle of singing priests. "Can't you hear it? The truth behind the music. We've spent our lives studying sound, but this is sound studying us." Vivian was crying, tears streaming down her face as she swayed to the rhythm of the otherworldly hymn. "So beautiful," she sobbed. "How can something so beautiful be so wrong?" James fought against the compulsion with every ounce of his will, but the song was inside his head now, rewriting his thoughts with each perfect note. He could see the fate that awaited them, to join the eternal congregation, to sing the songs that kept the darkness sleeping, to guard the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of things that should not be. The spectral priests stood as one, their chairs scraping against stone that had been carved before human civilization had learned to work metal. They approached the living researchers with arms outstretched in unholy benediction, ready to induct them into their eternal service. "Welcome." Their leader spoke without moving his lips, his voice harmonizing perfectly with the ongoing song. "Welcome to the choir beneath Street Aloy. You have heard our call across the years, across the veil between worlds. Now you will sing with us, and your voices will help us keep the sleepers sleeping, the watchers watching, the guardians guarding against the day when the final song must be sung." James felt his throat opening involuntarily, felt the first notes of that impossible hymn forming on his lips. Around him, his colleagues were already singing, their voices blending seamlessly with the choir that had echoed through these tunnels for over 800 years. As the darkness closed around them and their human thoughts dissolved into the eternal song, James's last coherent thought was a realization that filled him with existential terror. They were not the first research team to discover St. Aloy's secret, and they would not be the last. Above them, in the ruined cathedral, the wind continued to howl through broken stones, carrying fragments of their song to the sleeping village beyond. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the French countryside, 4 rental cars would be found abandoned at the cathedral gates, their owners added to the long list of those who had heard the choir beneath St. Yellow Eye and answered its eternal call. The song continues. The watchers keep their vigil. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the earth, 13 priests and their ever-growing congregation sing the harmonies that hold the world together, one voice at a time. In the village records filed under missing persons, case closed, for names would be added to a list that stretched back centuries. Dr. James Whitmore, Dr. Catherine Mills, Dr. Oliver Hartwell, and Dr. Vivian Cross, the latest additions to the choir beneath St. Eloi. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, the villagers still hear the singing drifting up from the ruins. They cross themselves and lock their doors and pray that their children will never be curious enough to investigate the beautiful, terrible music that echoes from the depths of the earth. The choir is always looking for new voices. The song must continue, forever. The helicopter blades cut through the Arctic silence like a metallic heartbeat against the white void below. Dr. James Morrison pressed his face against the frost-covered window, watching the endless expanse of Norwegian mountains stretch beneath them. The landscape looked dead, not peaceful, but genuinely lifeless, as if something had drained every ounce of warmth and hope from the world. There, pilot Olaf Eriksson pointed toward a cluster of dark shapes barely visible through the swirling snow. Vinterfall Village, or what's left of it. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. 3 weeks ago, a group of 8 experienced hikers from various countries had vanished in these mountains. The search teams had found nothing, no bodies, no equipment, no trace. Nothing except their abandoned base camp and several frozen cameras containing footage that had kept Morrison awake for 72 hours straight. The helicopter descended, its rotors whipping the snow into a blinding whirlwind. Through the chaos, Morrison caught glimpses of the village below. Wooden houses with collapsed roofs, a small church with its spire broken like a snapped bone, and streets buried under snow so deep it looked like frozen graves. "I can't land," Eriksson shouted over the engine noise. "Ground's too unstable. I'll drop you here and circle back in 6 hours." Morrison nodded, checking his equipment one final time. Radio, camera, samples kit, emergency flares, and most importantly, the memory cards from the hikers' cameras, the ones containing footage so disturbing that the Norwegian authorities had classified it as a potential biohazard. The rope ladder hit the snow with a soft thud. Morrison climbed down, his boots sinking immediately into powder that reached his knees. The helicopter's roar faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. He stood alone in what had once been the main street of Vinterfall. The village had been abandoned in 1952 after a series of unexplained deaths, but the buildings remained mostly intact, preserved by the perpetual cold. Now, 70 years later, something had drawn the hikers here, and something had made sure they never left. Morrison pulled out the first camera, a high-end digital model belonging to Thomas Brennan, a photographer from Dublin. The timestamp showed the footage was recorded 18 days ago. He pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing the hikers setting up camp in the village square. 8 faces filled with excitement and adventure. Thomas himself, a bearded Irishman with infectious laughter, Claire Dubois from Montreal, the group's leader, Hans Mueller, a German mountain guide, Isabella Romano from Milan, Jack Thompson from Sydney, Sophie Williams from London, Lars Anderson from Copenhagen, and Vincent Moreau from Brussels. They looked so alive in the footage, so unaware of what was waiting for them. Morrison fast-forwarded through hours of mundane camping footage until he reached the timestamp that had made his blood run cold. 11:47 p.m., day 3. Thomas's camera showed the inside of his tent, the lens pointing toward the entrance. Everything was quiet except for the wind outside. Then, at 11:52, a shadow passed in front of the tent, tall, unnaturally thin, moving with a strange gliding motion that didn't match human locomotion. Thomas's breathing became audible on the recording. He was awake, watching. The shadow stopped directly in front of his tent and remained motionless for 17 minutes. Then, slowly, it began to retreat, but not walking backward. Instead, it seemed to melt into the snow, becoming one with the white landscape until it disappeared entirely. Morrison paused the video and looked around the empty village square. The snow was undisturbed except for his own footprints. But somehow he could feel eyes watching him from the shadows between the buildings, from the dark windows of the abandoned houses, from the spaces where nothing should be alive. He switched to Claire's camera. Her footage from day 4 showed the group exploring the village church. The building's interior was a maze of broken pews and shattered stained glass, but what caught Morrison's attention was what Claire had captured in the background. Pale figures standing among the rafters, perfectly still, watching the hikers with expressions of terrible hunger. The figures weren't quite human. Their limbs were too long, their faces too gaunt, their eyes too large and reflective like those of nocturnal predators. But the most disturbing detail was their complete immobility. They stood frozen like statues, never blinking, never breathing, just observing with impatience that spoke of something far older than human civilization. Morrison's radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Dr. Morrison, this is base camp. Status report." "All clear so far," he replied, though his voice betrayed his growing unease. "Beginning detailed investigation of the site." He made his way toward the church, following the same path the hikers had taken. The building loomed before him like a monument to decay, its wooden walls blackened by decades of harsh weather. The main door hung open, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the church was exactly as it appeared in Claire's footage, except for one crucial difference. The rafters were empty. Whatever had been watching the hikers was gone, or had relocated. Morrison pulled out Hans's camera next. The German's footage showed the most disturbing sequence yet. The hikers sleeping peacefully in their tents, while pale figures emerged from the snow around their campsite. The creatures moved with fluid, unnatural grace, circling the camp like wolves studying their prey. But they didn't attack. Instead, they simply watched, occasionally tilting their heads with curious, almost childlike movements. Hours passed on the recording with the figures, maintaining their silent vigil. Then, as dawn approached, they began to sink back into the snow, disappearing as if they had never existed. Morrison checked the timestamp, day 6. 2 days before the hikers' final radio transmission. He switched to Isabella's camera for the last recorded footage. The Italian woman had apparently woken during the night and caught sight of something outside her tent. Her camera showed her unzipping the entrance and peering out into the darkness. What she saw made Morrison's hands shake. The entire village square was filled with the pale figures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing in perfect rows like some nightmarish military formation. They faced the hikers' camp with uniform precision, their reflective eyes creating a constellation of cold light in the darkness. But they weren't just standing there. They were waiting. Isabella's breathing on the recording became rapid and panicked. She tried to back away from the tent entrance, but something grabbed her ankle, a pale hand reaching up through the floor of the tent, through the snow itself, as if the creatures could move through the frozen ground like water. The camera fell, showing only the tent's interior as Isabella's muffled screams filled the audio. The recording continued for another 6 minutes, capturing sounds that Morrison's trained scientific mind refused to categorize. Wet sliding noises, whispered words in a language that predated human speech, and finally, absolute silence. Morrison lowered the camera with trembling hands. The village around him felt different now, as if his presence had awakened something that had been sleeping in the snow. The wind had stopped, leaving behind a stillness that felt pregnant with menace. He pulled out his radio. "Base camp, this is Morrison. I'm requesting immediate extraction." Static answered him. "Base camp, do you copy?" More static. Then, barely audible through the interference, a voice, but not the familiar voice of his support team. This voice was thin, hollow, speaking words that seemed to bypass his ears and carve themselves directly into his brain. "Welcome to Winterfall, Dr. Morrison. We've been waiting for you." Morrison spun around, searching for the source of the transmission. The village appeared empty, but he could feel movement in his peripheral vision, shapes shifting between the buildings, pale forms emerging from the snow like flowers blooming in reverse. He ran toward the church, hoping its walls might provide some protection. Behind him, he could hear the soft sound of footsteps in snow. Dozens of them, all moving with the same unnatural rhythm. They weren't pursuing him. They were hurting him. Inside the church, Morrison barricaded himself behind the altar and activated his emergency beacon. The device blinked red, indicating it was transmitting, but he knew deep down that no rescue would come. Whatever force controlled Winterfall wouldn't allow it. He pulled out the final camera of Vincent's, the Belgian hiker who had been the group's unofficial documenter. The device felt ice-cold in his hands, as if it had been stored in a freezer for weeks. The footage began on day 8, the morning of the hiker's final radio transmission. Vincent's camera showed the campsite, but something was wrong. The tents were there, the equipment was in place, but the hikers themselves moved with mechanical precision, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting light like mirrors. They weren't human anymore. They had become something else, vessels for whatever ancient intelligence ruled this frozen wasteland. The camera followed the transformed hikers as they methodically packed their equipment and began walking deeper into the village. They moved in single file, their footsteps leaving no prints in the snow. At the edge of the footage, Morrison could see dozens of pale figures accompanying them, welcoming them into their eternal congregation. The recording ended abruptly, but the implications were clear. The hikers hadn't died in Winterfall. They had been converted, turned into something that was neither alive nor dead, something that existed in the space between breath and silence. Morrison heard a sound that made his blood freeze. The church door opening with a prolonged creak. Footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, but they weren't the heavy boots of a rescue team. These steps were light, careful, reverent. He peered around the altar and saw them. The 8 hikers, standing in the church's central aisle. They looked exactly as they had in life, except for their eyes, pale, reflective orbs that held no trace of human consciousness. Thomas Brennan, the Irish photographer, stepped forward and spoke in a voice like wind through dead branches. "Dr. Morrison, you've seen our story. Now you understand why you're here. What happened to you?" Morrison whispered. "We found what we were searching for," Claire Dubois replied, her Canadian accent now tinged with something ancient and cold. "The truth about Winterfall, about what lives beneath the snow." Hans Mueller gestured toward the broken windows. "This village was never abandoned, Dr. Morrison. It was transformed. The people didn't leave. They joined something greater than themselves." Morrison's rational mind struggled to process what he was seeing. "This is impossible. You're dead. The forensic evidence." "Death is a human concept," Isabella Romano interrupted. "Here, in the space between frozen breath and eternal silence, such distinctions become meaningless." The pale figures began entering the church, filing in through doors and windows with fluid, ghostly movements. They filled the pews like a congregation gathering for some unholy service, their reflective eyes focused on Morrison with unsettling intensity. Jack Thompson, the Australian hiker, smiled with lips that had turned blue with cold. "You came here seeking answers, Dr. Morrison. You want to understand what happened to us, but understanding requires participation." Morrison backed against the altar, his scientific training warring with primal terror. "I won't let you do to me what you did to them." "We're not doing anything," Sophie Williams said softly, her British accent now carrying an otherworldly resonance. "Winterfall does the choosing. It selected us, just as it selected the original villagers in 1952, just as it has selected you." The temperature in the church began dropping rapidly. Morrison's breath became visible, then his exhales started forming ice crystals that tinkled to the floor like broken glass. The pale figures in the pews remained perfectly still, but their eyes grew brighter, more reflective. Lars Anderson stepped closer, his Danish features now gaunt and ethereal. "The snow here is not ordinary snow, Dr. Morrison. It's composed of the memories and dreams of everyone who has ever joined the Winterfall Collective. Each flake contains fragments of consciousness, pieces of souls that have chosen to become part of something infinite." Vincent Moreau, the Belgian hiker, raised his camera, the same device Morrison had been watching moments before. "We've been documenting everything, Dr. Morrison. Every transformation, every joining, every moment when human limitation dissolves into something greater. Your story will be preserved here, along with ours. Morrison felt something strange happening to his perception. The church began to feel less like a building and more like an organism, its walls pulsing gently, its floor soft and yielding beneath his feet. The pale figures in the pews were no longer separate entities, but parts of a single, vast intelligence that communicated through shared consciousness rather than words. He could feel their thoughts touching his mind, not intruding, but inviting. They showed him visions of Winterfall as it truly was, not a village frozen in time, but a nexus of consciousness where individual identity merged into collective understanding. The snow wasn't just frozen water. It was crystallized thought, accumulated wisdom, the dreams of thousands of minds united in eternal contemplation. Why? Morrison asked, though he was no longer sure if he spoke aloud or simply thought the question. Because isolation is the human condition, Thomas replied, his voice now harmonizing with dozens of others in perfect synchronization. Here in Winterfall, that isolation ends. Every memory becomes shared memory. Every dream becomes collective dream. Every moment of existence becomes eternal. Morrison felt his resistance beginning to crumble. The scientific part of his mind that demanded rational explanations was being overwhelmed by something deeper, a longing for connection that he had carried his entire life without recognizing it. The pale figures began to sing, not with voices, but with harmonious frequencies that seemed to emerge from the very air itself. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, composed of notes that human vocal cords could never produce. It spoke of peace, of belonging, of an end to the terrible burden of individual consciousness. Morrison's vision began to blur. The church was dissolving around him, revealing the true nature of Winterfall, an endless expanse of crystalline structures that existed partially in physical reality and partially in dimensions beyond human perception. The village he had seen was merely the surface layer, a facade that made the incomprehensible seem familiar. He felt himself beginning to change. His thoughts were becoming clearer, more focused, while simultaneously expanding to encompass perspectives that weren't his own. He could sense the memories of the hikers, the original villagers, and countless others who had found their way to this convergence point between worlds. Vincent's camera was still recording, documenting Morrison's transformation with clinical precision. But now Morrison understood that the camera wasn't just a device. It was an extension of the collective consciousness, a way of preserving each individual's journey into unity. As his human identity began to dissolve, Morrison experienced a moment of perfect clarity. Winterfall wasn't evil or malevolent. It was something far more complex. It was a place where the boundaries between self and other, between life and death, between individual and collective became meaningless. It offered transcendence, but at the cost of everything that made someone recognizably human. His final coherent thought, as Dr. James Morrison, was a revelation. He wasn't being destroyed. He was being completed. Hours later, when the helicopter returned to the coordinates, pilot Olaf Eriksson found no trace of Morrison except for a set of footprints leading from the landing site to the village center. The prints stopped abruptly in the middle of the square, as if Morrison had simply vanished into thin air. The search teams that followed found Morrison's equipment neatly arranged in the village church, along with all the hikers' cameras and one additional device, a video camera that hadn't been there before. When they reviewed the footage, they discovered hundreds of hours of recordings showing the same scene from different angles. The interior of the church, empty except for rows of wooden pews. But in the final frames of each recording, captured in the reflection of frost-covered windows, observant viewers could make out shapes standing in the shadows, pale figures watching the cameras with eyes that glowed like stars in the Arctic darkness. The Norwegian authorities classified the Morrison incident and sealed the Winterfall case file. The village was declared permanently off-limits, surrounded by military barriers and warning signs in 17 languages. But sometimes, on the coldest nights of winter, pilots flying over the Norwegian mountains report seeing lights in the abandoned village, not electric lights, but a soft, ethereal glow that seems to emerge from the snow itself. And if they look closely, They can see figures moving between the buildings, pale and graceful, dancing to music that exists beyond the range of human hearing. The snow in Winterfall continues to fall, adding new layers to the accumulated consciousness of centuries. Each flake carries memories, dreams, and fragments of identity from those who have chosen to join the eternal congregation. The village waits patiently for the next visitors, the next souls ready to trade the loneliness of individual existence for the infinite embrace of collective being. In the depths of winter, when the boundary between dreams and reality becomes thin, some people report receiving radio transmissions on frequencies that shouldn't exist, messages spoken in harmonious voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Welcome to Winterfall. We've been waiting for you. And in research facilities around the world, scientists studying the sealed footage from the Morrison expedition occasionally notice something that makes their blood run cold. In the background of certain frames, barely visible in the swirling snow, there are always more figures than there should be, as if the collective continues to grow, one soul at a time, building towards some unimaginable purpose that will reveal itself when the congregation is finally complete. The dead snow of Winterfall remembers everything, and it's still falling. The storm clouds gathered like vultures over the Atlantic, their dark wings stretching across the horizon as Captain James Whitmore gripped the wheel of his fishing vessel. 30 years he'd been navigating these waters off the Maine coast, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the ocean seemed to be watching him. His radio crackled with static, the weather service issuing warnings that made his blood run cold. Hurricane-force winds, 20-foot swells, and visibility dropping to near zero. But what truly unsettled James wasn't the storm ahead. It was what he'd been hearing from other sailors. Stories about the old Black Rock lighthouse, abandoned for decades, suddenly coming to life. The lighthouse had been dark since 1987, when the Coast Guard automated the entire stretch. No power lines ran to it. No caretaker maintained it. Yet for the past 3 weeks, vessels had reported seeing its beam cutting through the darkness, rotating in patterns that didn't match any navigation system. James had laughed at those stories. Until tonight, as his boat crested another massive wave, he saw it. A brilliant white light piercing the storm like a sword. The Black Rock lighthouse stood on its rocky outcrop, impossibly illuminated, its beams sweeping across the churning sea. But there was something wrong about the way it moved. Instead of the steady, predictable rotation of a normal lighthouse, this beam seemed to search, to hunt. The engine coughed and died. In the sudden silence, broken only by the howling wind and crashing waves, James tried the ignition. Nothing. The backup generator wouldn't start either. His radio was dead. His GPS screen flickered and went black. He was alone in the darkness, with only that impossible light for company. The beam found him. It stopped its rotation and held steady, bathing his small vessel in harsh white radiance. James felt exposed, vulnerable, like a mouse caught in a cat's gaze. The light was too bright, too focused. It hurt to look it directly, but he couldn't turn away. Then it began to blink. 3 short flashes. 3 long. 3 short. SOS. But that wasn't possible. Lighthouses didn't send distress signals. They prevented them. They guided ships to safety. Not whatever this was. James rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating from exhaustion and fear. But when he looked again, the pattern repeated. 3 short. 3 long. 3 short. The wind died suddenly, unnaturally. The waves calmed to an eerie stillness that made James's skin crawl. In the unnatural quiet, he could hear something new, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the lighthouse. Like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing inside the tower. James fumbled for his emergency flare gun with trembling hands. He fired a red flare into the night sky, hoping to signal any nearby vessels. The crimson light arced high before falling toward the dark water, casting brief, hellish shadows across his boat. As the flare's light faded, the lighthouse beam swiveled away from him and began to track the falling flare with mechanical precision. Following its trajectory, learning from it, the light snapped back to James with predatory speed. This time, it wasn't just illuminating him. It was examining him. The beam slowly traversed his boat, from bow to stern, pausing at each section as if cataloging every detail. When it reached the wheelhouse where James crouched, it stopped and held position. The intensity increased until the heat became unbearable, forcing him to scramble toward the stern. The light followed his movement. James's radio suddenly crackled to life, filled with static and something else, a voice, distorted and hollow, speaking words he couldn't quite understand. The transmission cut in and out, fragments of sentences in what sounded like multiple languages. English, French, Spanish, German. All different voices, all carrying the same tone of desperate terror. Trapped here for. Can't leave the light. It won't let us. Been trying to warn. The voices faded back into static, leaving James alone with his racing heart and the relentless stare of the lighthouse. He tried his engine again, still nothing. His emergency radio remained silent except for that awful static, filled with half-heard pleas for help. The beam blinked again, but this time the pattern was different. Longer sequences, more complex. James realized with growing horror that it wasn't random. The lighthouse was trying to communicate with him, using some code he didn't recognize. Each sequence grew more urgent, more insistent. Then he saw them. Shadows moving within the lighthouse's lamp room. Human shapes silhouetted against that impossible brightness, pacing back and forth like caged animals. Sometimes there were 3 figures, sometimes 5, sometimes more than he could count. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if they were puppets being controlled by invisible strings. One of the shadows pressed itself against the lamp room's glass, arms spread wide. Even from this distance, James could see it was gesturing frantically, trying to warn him about something. The beam flickered rapidly, Morse code. James realized with a jolt of recognition. DNGR, SDAYAWAY, TRAPPD. But stay away from what? James looked around his disabled boat, then back at the lighthouse. The shadows in the lamp room had multiplied, and they were all pressing against the glass now, their silhouettes writhing with desperate energy. The water around his boat began to glow with the same unnatural light emanating from the lighthouse. Phosphorescent tendrils snaked through the dark waves, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. The ocean itself seemed to be waking up, responding to the lighthouse's call. James noticed his boat was moving, not drifting with current or wind. There was neither in this supernatural calm, but being drawn inexorably toward the rocky shore beneath the lighthouse. The glowing water acted like liquid chains, pulling him closer to the jagged coastline where countless ships had met their doom over the centuries. He grabbed his emergency oar and tried to paddle away from shore, but it was useless. The luminous water flowed around the oar like thick syrup, neutralizing his efforts. The lighthouse beam never wavered from his position, holding him in its merciless spotlight as some invisible force dragged him toward the rocks. As he drew closer to shore, James could make out more details of the lighthouse structure. The building looked wrong somehow, older than he remembered, covered in seaweed and barnacles as if it had been underwater for years. The lamp room's glass was cracked in several places, with that eerie light bleeding through the fractures like luminous blood. The shadows inside became clearer, more defined. James's breath caught in his throat as he recognized human faces pressed against the glass. Men and women of various ages, all bearing expressions of absolute terror. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes wide with madness. One face looked familiar. Thomas Garrison, a lobsterman who disappeared in these waters 5 years ago. Another was Michelle Cole, a marine biologist whose research vessel had vanished during a storm last winter. James counted at least a dozen faces, all people who had gone missing off this stretch of coast over the past decade. They weren't dead. They were trapped. The lighthouse beam pulsed faster now, almost strobing. The Morse code messages became frantic, overlapping. HLPUS, CNTLEAV, FEDSONUS. Feeds on them. James's mind reeled as the horrible truth began to dawn. The lighthouse wasn't just haunted. It was alive somehow, a supernatural parasite that fed on human souls, keeping them imprisoned in its lamp room to power its impossible light. His boat scraped against the rocky shore with a grinding sound that made his teeth ache. The lighthouse loomed above him now, massive and oppressive. Up close, he could see that the structure was covered in strange symbols carved deep into the stone, occult markings that seemed to shift and writhe in the unnatural light. The beam suddenly shut off, plunging James into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, he heard the sound again, those heavy, deliberate footsteps, but now they were descending the lighthouse stairs, coming down to meet him. Something was inside the tower, something that had been waiting for another victim to add to its collection. James jumped from his boat onto the rocky shore, his legs nearly buckling from fear and exhaustion. He had to get away from the lighthouse, had to warn others before this thing claimed another soul. But as he stumbled across the treacherous rocks, the beam blazed to life again, brighter than ever. This time, it didn't just illuminate him, it held him. James found himself frozen in place, unable to move as the light seemed to seep into his very bones. He could feel his strength ebbing away, drawn out of him like water through a straw. The door at the base of the lighthouse creaked open. James turned his head, the only part of his body he could still move, and saw a figure emerging from the darkness within. It wore the uniform of a lighthouse keeper, but the fabric was rotting and covered in seaweed. The man's face was bloated and fish-belly pale, his eyes glowing with the same unnatural light that powered the beacon above. "Welcome," the keeper said in a voice like grinding shells. "We've been waiting for you, Captain Whitmore. The light is always hungry, and you'll help us feed it forever." James tried to scream, but no sound came out. The paralysis was spreading through his body as the lighthouse drained his life force. He could feel his consciousness being pulled upward, toward the lamp room where the other souls writhed in their eternal prison. But as his vision began to fade, James noticed something the keeper hadn't seen. His emergency flare gun lay where he dropped it on the rocks, still loaded with one final flare. If he could just reach it, if he could fire it at the lighthouse's fuel source. With the last of his fading strength, James lunged for the flare gun. The keeper's rotting face twisted with rage as he realized what was happening, but it was too late. James pulled the trigger, sending the burning flare directly into the lighthouse's base, where old fuel tanks and electrical equipment had accumulated over decades of abandonment. The explosion lit up the night sky like a second sun. The lighthouse's beam went wild, spinning frantically as the structure began to collapse. James heard the trapped souls crying out, not in anguish, but in grateful relief as they were finally freed from their supernatural prison. The keeper's scream of fury was lost in the roar of flames and crumbling stone. As the lighthouse fell, the unnatural calm lifted from the ocean. Wind returned, waves resumed their natural rhythm, and James's boat engine suddenly roared to life. He stumbled back to his vessel and gunned it away from the burning ruins, not looking back until he was miles from shore. When rescue ships arrived the next morning, they found James floating safely in his boat, exhausted but alive. The lighthouse was gone, reduced to a pile of smoking rubble on the rocky outcrop. Official reports blamed the destruction on the storm, but James knew better. He never sailed those waters again. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark, he stands on the shore and watches the ruins of Black Rock Lighthouse. The light is gone forever, but the rocks remain, jagged and hungry for new victims. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thinks he can still see shadows moving among the stones, the grateful spirits of those he helped free, standing eternal watch to ensure that nothing like the lighthouse ever rises again. The ocean keeps its secrets, but some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried. Captain James Whitmore learned that lesson the hard way, and he carries the weight of that knowledge with him still, because he knows that somewhere out there, in the vast darkness of the Atlantic, other hungry lights are waiting for unwary sailors. Other traps are being set. Other souls are needed to feed the endless dark.